He sat alone at that table for 29 minutes. Not because he was early, because she was late. And in those 29 minutes, Landon Pierce made a decision that most people would never admit to. He decided she wasn't coming, and that it was fine, because nothing in his life ever came easy anyway. He reached for his jacket. Then the door opened, and the woman who walked in, rain-soaked, breathless, apologizing to strangers she'd nearly knocked over, looked straight at him and said 4 words that stopped time. "You have kind eyes." This is their story. Stay until the end, and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. The invitation had come on a Tuesday, which was already a bad sign. Tuesdays were Landon Pierce's worst day of the week. Not because anything particularly terrible had ever happened on a Tuesday, though plenty of terrible things had, but because Tuesday was the day between getting through Monday and almost reaching the weekend, and it sat there in the middle of the week like a pothole you couldn't swerve around. You just hit it and kept driving. He'd been standing in his driveway that Tuesday morning, loading equipment into the back of his pickup truck before 6 a.m. when Marcus called. "You're going on a date Friday night," Marcus said. No greeting, no preamble. Just that, the way Marcus always delivered news he knew Landon would refuse was fast, so there was no opening for an argument. "I'm not," Landon said. "Already set it up." "Then unset it up." "Can't. She's expecting you, 7 o'clock. Carmine's on 5th. Landon shoved a toolbox into the truck bed harder than he needed to. Metal clanged against metal. Down the street, a dog started barking. He pressed the phone harder against his ear and stared at the pale purple sky over the rooftops of his neighborhood. The kind of pre-dawn color that looked almost peaceful if you didn't have 47 things to worry about. "Marcus?" "Landon. I have a 6-year-old. Mrs. Bellamy said she'd take Cora until 9. You called Mrs. Bellamy before you called me?" A brief pause. "I called Mrs. Bellamy first, yeah." Landon exhaled through his nose. He stood there for a moment with his hand resting on the tailgate, watching his own breath cloud in the cold morning air. He thought about saying no. He was very good at saying no. He'd said no to a lot of things over the past 4 years. No to his mother's matchmaking attempts. No to his buddy Derek's suggestion that he try one of those dating apps. No to the HR coordinator at a job site last spring who'd slid her number across a table with a smile that deserved better than what he could give anyone right now. He always had a reason, a solid one. "What do I even know about this woman?" he asked. "She's smart, she's beautiful, she's a little intense, but in a good way. She works in tech." "That's nothing, Marcus. That's what you'd say about a laptop." "She's a good person, Landon. I'm telling you. Just show up. One dinner. You don't like her, you come home, you never have to do it again. But show up." Landon closed the tailgate. The truck shook with the impact. 7 o'clock, he said flatly. 7 o'clock, Marcus confirmed, and the relief in his voice was so obvious it was almost embarrassing. Landon Pierce had not always been the kind of man who needed convincing to go on a date. There had been a version of him, younger, looser, more willing to gamble, who would have laughed at the idea of needing a friend to make reservations on his behalf just to get him out of the house on a Friday night. That version of Landon had been a construction foreman's apprentice at 23, working hard but not caring much, traveling light. He'd had a quick smile and a habit of staying out too late, and a genuine, uncomplicated belief that things worked out if you put in the effort. Then he'd met Danielle, and then Danielle had gotten pregnant, and then they'd gotten married, fast and practical, in a county courthouse with 2 witnesses and a judge who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. And then Cora was born, 5 pounds, 11 ounces, with a tuft of dark hair and a face so impossibly small that Landon had stood in the hospital corridor afterwards and cried in a way he hadn't cried since his father died. Not sad crying, something else entirely, something that had no name. And then, when Cora was 18 months old, Danielle left. Not dramatically, not with a fight or a slammed door or a tearful confrontation in the rain. She'd just stopped being there, first emotionally, then physically. She'd told Landon, with a directness that he'd almost respected for its honesty, that she loved Cora but she hadn't been ready for any of this, that she'd tried to be ready and she wasn't, and that staying was going to make her into something she didn't want to become. She'd moved to Portland. She called on birthdays. She sent gifts at Christmas that were thoughtful in a way that almost made it worse. Landon had never spoken badly about her to Cora. He'd decided that early and held to it like a structural principle, the way you decide a building's foundation before you pour anything, because changing it later costs more than you have. But the man who'd come out the other side of those years was a different man than the one who'd gone in. Quieter, more careful, better at reading what other people needed and worse at asking for what he needed himself. He ran a small construction company now, Pierce & Sons, though the sons were currently theoretical, with 6 employees he trusted and a reputation for showing up when he said he would and doing what he said he'd do. His entire professional life ran on the principle that reliability was the only real currency. His personal life had been largely closed for business. He was, as his mother frequently pointed out, 32 years old. He had, as Marcus frequently pointed out, the social habits of a retired monk. Friday arrived the way Fridays always did at the tail end of a long week, with a kind of exhausted inevitability, like the last mile of a run you'd already mostly survived. Landon had spent the day on a residential renovation in Eastfield, fixing structural damage from water intrusion that a previous contractor had patched without solving. The kind of work that required him to open up walls and confront what the original builder had tried to hide, which he found quietly satisfying in a way that probably said something about his personality. By 4:30, he was back at the house, sawdust in his hair and a scrape along his left forearm from where he'd caught a rough edge of drywall. He stood in the bathroom mirror and did an honest assessment. 32. Not bad looking, if he was being objective, though he rarely was. Brown hair that needed cutting but hadn't crossed into shaggy, a jaw that was currently carrying about 4 days of stubble, which was either intentional or evidence of neglect, depending on who was asking. Brown eyes that people occasionally called warm and that he thought of as just brown. He showered. He put on the one dress shirt he owned that didn't have a paint stain on it, a dark navy thing his mother had given him for his birthday, and a pair of dark pants that fit properly because Cora had made him buy them for her kindergarten graduation ceremony 6 months ago. Standing in the dressing room doorway with her arms crossed, 5 years old, and already fully capable of a look that brooked no argument. "You look nice, Daddy," she said from the bathroom doorway, watching him attempt to do something with his hair. "I look like a guy who doesn't know how to dress himself. Mrs. Bellamy said you're going on a date." He met her eyes in the mirror. She was standing in her socks on the cold tile floor, holding her stuffed rabbit by one ear, watching him with an expression of intense scientific interest. "I'm going to dinner," he said. "With a lady?" "Presumably." Cora considered this with the gravity of a judge weighing evidence. "Is she nice?" "I don't know. I've never met her." "How can you go on a date with someone you've never met?" "That's a genuinely excellent question." She appeared satisfied with this answer, though she didn't move from the doorway. "Will you be back before I go to sleep?" He crouched down to her level. She smelled like the grape-scented shampoo she'd insisted on buying at the drugstore last month, and which he'd used once by accident and subsequently smelled like grape candy for an entire workday. He tugged gently on the ear of the rabbit. "I'll be back before 9, he said. "I promise." "Okay?" She leaned forward and pressed her forehead briefly against his, the way she always did when she was saying something she didn't have words for. Then she turned and padded back down the hallway in her socks, rabbit trailing behind her, already on to whatever came next. He watched her go. One dinner, he told himself. Then home. Carmine's on 5th was the kind of Italian restaurant that had been in the same location for 30 years without changing much, which was exactly why it had survived, when every trendy place around it had cycled through bankruptcy. Red check tablecloths that were slightly ironic, but also genuine. Candles in wine bottles. A piano player on weekends who played songs people actually recognized. The kind of place you brought someone when you wanted the evening to feel special without making it feel like you were trying too hard. Landon arrived at 6:53. The hostess, a young woman with dark hair and the efficient warmth of someone who'd worked in hospitality long enough to mean it, led him to a corner table near the window and told him his companion hadn't arrived yet, but that she'd be right over with water. "Thank you," he said, and sat down. 6:53 became 7 o'clock. 7 o'clock became 7:10. The breadbasket arrived. He ate one piece of bread and then felt like he should stop in case she arrived and the basket was already half depleted. He wasn't sure why that mattered. It just seemed like the kind of detail a person noticed. 7:10 became 7:15. Outside, the rain started. A proper autumn rain, not just drizzle, the kind that came down with purpose and made the streetlights bloom outward in the wet. He watched people outside hurrying under awnings and sharing umbrellas and doing the hunch sprint that people do when they're pretending they don't mind getting wet. He checked his phone. Nothing. He had Marcus's number pulled up on his screen, a draft message that said, "I don't think she's coming," that he'd been composing and deleting for the past 8 minutes. The thing about sitting alone at a restaurant table when someone is late is that there is a very specific kind of feeling that comes with it. It isn't quite embarrassment, though there's some of that. It isn't quite anger. It's something more like a slow, quiet deflation, the feeling of having arranged yourself around an expectation that has started to collapse, and the strange dignity required to stay upright anyway while it happens. Landon knew that feeling well. It was familiar enough that he'd developed a relationship with it. He understood that the feeling was not about her. He didn't know her, and not really about the date, which he hadn't wanted to come on in the first place. It was about the predictable failure of hoping. He ate a second piece of bread. 5 more minutes, he decided. 5 more minutes, and then I order the pasta, eat alone, and call this a wash. He looked out at the rain. He thought about Cora and her socks. He thought about the water-damaged wall he'd opened up that morning, the way the damage had been there for years underneath everything, invisible and getting worse, while people walked by it every day and never knew. He reached for his jacket. The door opened. He heard it first, the rush of cold, wet air from outside, the brief amplification of rain sound, the soft collision of the door against its frame. And he looked up, reflexively, the way you do in a restaurant when someone enters, not with expectation, just the automatic alertness of a man who'd spent years reading spaces for hazards. She was already in motion. That was the first thing he registered. She was moving, still moving, like the restaurant was just a continuation of whatever urgency had propelled her here. Her coat was dark and rain-dark at the shoulders, and she was shaking water from her hair with one hand while the other went out reflexively to steady herself on a chair she'd nearly bumped. She said something to the hostess, quick, quiet, apologetic. And the hostess pointed in his direction, and she turned. She looked at him. Not at the table, not at the room, at him. Directly, immediately, as if she'd already known where to look. He had already started to stand, partly out of the habit of courtesy, and partly because there was something in the directness of her gaze that required a response from your body before your brain finished processing it. She crossed the room in a way that was unself-conscious about the fact that her hair was slightly wet, and her coat had raindrops on the collar, and she was probably a full 27 minutes late. She moved like someone who was acutely aware of her own lateness, and had made a decision not to let it make her smaller. And then she stopped at the table. She looked at him, and she said, not as an opening line, not as the beginning of an apology, but the way you say something true that surprises you by being true, Pitts. She said, "You have kind eyes." Landon blinked. Whatever he'd been prepared to say, a polite hello, "It's fine, don't worry about it," evaporated. He stood there for a half second with his mouth not quite doing anything, and then he said, "I'm sorry." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, not tentatively, like she'd decided to arrive fully wherever she was, and she'd arrived here. "I'm late," she said. "I know, I'm Vivian. I'm sorry." She set her bag on the floor, shrugged the wet coat off her shoulders, and then looked at him again with a frankness that was somehow not rude. "But I meant what I said. You have kind eyes. I could see it from across the room." "I was about to leave," he said. He didn't mean it as an accusation. It just came out. Something shifted in her face. Not guilt. She'd already covered that, but something more like recognition. "I know," she said quietly. "I could see that too." He sat down slowly. "Landon," he said. Landon Pierce. Vivian Sterling. She extended her hand across the table, and he shook it. Her grip was firm and quick. Marcus tells me you build things. Marcus tells people whatever gets them to say yes. She laughed. A real laugh. Not the polished kind, slightly too loud and quickly self-corrected. Yeah, he told me you were quiet and interesting, which is what people say when they're not sure what you actually are. He told me you work in tech. He told me you'd think that was an insufficient description. He was right. He usually is, she said. It's annoying. The waiter arrived. Young guy, maybe 22, visibly nervous about something, juggling 2 menus and a wine list with one hand while his phone buzzed persistently in his apron pocket. He set the menus down, knocked over the small vase in the center of the table, caught it before it fell, set it back up, and said, "Can I get you started with anything to drink?" in a tone that suggested the question was costing him something. "Water's fine for me," Landon said. "Do you have the Barolo?" Vivian asked. Yes, I think so. The 2019. Perfect. A glass of that, please. He wrote it down. His phone buzzed again. He looked up at them with an expression of concentrated apology. "I'll be right back. I'm sorry. It's been a..." He stopped. "I'll be right back." He retreated toward the bar. "Long night for him," Landon said. "Long night for a lot of people," Vivian said. She was watching the space where he'd gone with something attentive in her expression. Not critical, just watching. "My mom's sick," she said then. Sideways, almost, like it came out before she decided to say it. Landon looked at her. "That's why I was late," she said. "My brother called. He's been handling a lot of the treatment coordination, and sometimes he just..." She stopped, pressed her lips together briefly. "He needed to talk, and I pulled over, and then I lost complete track of time." She looked at him directly. "I don't want to start this with a lie. The traffic excuse would have been easier, but I don't want to start this with a lie." The word "this" hung between them in the candlelight. "Is your mom going to be okay?" he asked. She held his gaze for a moment. "Honestly, we don't know yet. I'm sorry. Thank you." Something in her posture shifted, fractionally, like a door opening a crack. "Your daughter, Cora?" Marcus said her name was Cora. "Yeah. How old?" 6. "Does she know you're here?" "She asked if you were nice. I told her I didn't know yet." Something moved in Vivian's eyes. Amusement, yes, but something else alongside it. "Very diplomatic. I try." The food came wrong. Not catastrophically wrong. Landon had ordered the chicken piccata and instead received a plate of veal with a side of roasted vegetables that was clearly intended for the table behind them, where a man in a blazer was now staring at a plate of chicken piccata with the mild confusion of someone who hadn't ordered it but wasn't certain enough to say something. The waiter reappeared with the slightly hunted expression of someone who'd just realized the error a beat too late to prevent it. "I am so sorry," he said, his voice dropping to an actual whisper of distress. "I switched the tables. I'll get that fixed right now. I'm so..." "Hey!" Vivian's voice was calm and even. Not performatively nice. Not the kind of calm you do for other people to see. Just genuinely, practically calm. "It's okay, honestly. Bring it when you can. We're not in a hurry." The waiter looked at her with the specific gratitude of a person who'd been bracing for something worse. "I really apologize. I mean it," she said. "It's fine. Take care of the other table first." She picked up her wine glass. "We have plenty to talk about." He thanked her twice more, which was perhaps once more than necessary, and disappeared toward the kitchen. Landon watched this exchange. He'd been in a lot of restaurants. He'd watched a lot of people respond to small inconveniences in a lot of ways. He'd learned, over years of working with people and managing people and watching people under the minor pressures of everyday life, that how a person treated service workers under mild stress was one of the more accurate available pieces of data you had about them early on. Vivian had passed that test without appearing to think she was taking one. "You didn't have to do that," he said. She looked at him. "Do what?" "Be that nice about it." He looked like he was about to have a panic attack over a chicken dish. She set her wine glass down. "What would being difficult accomplish?" Nothing, Landon said. That's kind of the point. She studied him for a moment. The way she kept doing, this direct, unguarded looking that he was starting to understand was just how she engaged with the world, not an act and not a performance. You do that too, she said. Don't you? I try to. With Cora? With everyone. I try to. I don't always manage it. No one does, she said. The evening opened up after that. Not in the way evenings open up when everything is going well, that smooth, effortless unfolding that you only recognize in retrospect. This was rougher than that and more real. There were pauses that lasted a beat too long. There were moments where one of them said something and the other clearly had a response that they chose not to give. Not yet, because trust is a construction project and you don't put the roof on before you've built the walls. Vivian asked about his work with genuine curiosity, not the polite variety. She asked specific questions about project timelines, about how he managed subcontractors, about whether he found it hard to go from doing the physical work to managing the people who did it. She remembered details he mentioned early in the conversation and referenced them later, which was the sort of active listening that people talked about in corporate seminars, but most people didn't actually do. You like the problem-solving part, she said, about 40 minutes in. Not just the building, the figuring out. He considered this. Yeah, I like when something doesn't make sense yet, and then it does. What made you start your own company? A brief hesitation. I needed the flexibility, he said. When her mom left, I needed to be able to set my own schedule. I couldn't work for someone else and also be the only parent she had. So you built the thing that let you be where you needed to be. Something like that. She was quiet for a moment. There was something in the quiet that wasn't uncomfortable, which he noticed because silences with people you've just met are usually full of the anxious maintenance noise of people who don't trust the quiet. She wasn't filling it because she didn't need to. I have 47 employees, she said then, and there are days when I have no idea how I got here. She picked up her fork and turned it over in her fingers, looking at it. Not in a false modest way. The decisions kept compounding, and then you look up and you've built something and you're responsible for all of it. And the thing that surprised me most was that it doesn't feel the way I thought it would. What did you think it would feel like? Finished. She looked up. I thought at some point it would feel finished, like I'd done the thing and I could exhale. But it just... She set the fork down. It just keeps being the next thing. Yeah, Landon said. You know that? Parenting is like that, he said simply. She went very still for just a moment, and then she said softly, God, yeah, I guess it is. By 9 o'clock, 3 couples had left the restaurant around them, and 2 new ones had been seated. The piano player in the corner had shifted from background standards to something quieter and more deliberate. The rain, which had been steady all evening, had begun to ease. The waiter, who had eventually brought the correct meal and had hovered around their table with the anxious energy of someone trying to atone, cleared their dishes with a now calmer efficiency. He'd recovered. The dinner rush had eased. He'd been kind to them throughout, and Vivian had noticed, and when she'd asked him at some point in the evening how his night was going, he'd said better now in a way that seemed to mean it. Can I ask you something? Landon said. You can ask me anything. Why did you come tonight? She looked at him. I know why I came. Marcus basically organized it before consulting me, but I get the feeling nobody organizes things for you before consulting you. A slow half smile. Nobody tries twice. So why? Because I'm tired, she said. The simplicity of it seemed to catch even her off guard. She blinked. I'm tired of everyone wanting something specific from me. When I go on dates, the few times I go on dates, there's always this awareness, like they've done research, like they know the company valuation before they know my coffee order. She turned her wine glass slowly on the table. Marcus told me you almost said no, that you had to be talked into this. That's accurate. That was the thing. She looked at him with a directness that was almost startling, that someone had to talk you into meeting me. Not because I know what I am professionally. I'm not pretending not to know, But you didn't know what you were saying no to, which means you weren't saying yes for the reasons people usually say yes. The silence between them held something now. He could feel it. I looked you up, he said. She raised an eyebrow. After Marcus called, I Googled you. He held her gaze. And then I thought, this is already weird, and I almost called it off again. What stopped you? He thought about Cora in the doorway with her rabbit. He thought about the water-damaged wall he'd spent the day opening up. He said, I think I was just tired of saying no. The check came and Vivian took it before he reached for it. Not aggressively, just quickly, without fanfare, sliding it off the table and opening it while he started to say something. I invited you, she said, which wasn't technically accurate given that Marcus had orchestrated the whole thing, but wasn't technically inaccurate in any way that mattered. I know you can. She looked up at him briefly. I know you can. I'm not doing this to demonstrate something. I just got here late and I should make up for the bread you had to eat alone for 27 minutes. He paused. You know exactly how late you were. I've been keeping track since I walked in. He sat back. Okay. Thank you, she said, without any of the performance of graciousness. Just the words, direct. Biss said. Outside, the rain had stopped. The pavement was still wet, reflecting the orange sodium of the streetlights in long, wavering lines, and the air had that particular clean, cold quality of a city street after rain, like the world had been briefly rinsed. Vivian's car was parked 2 spots down. He registered it the way you register something you weren't looking for. A black SUV, late model, sleek, attended by a driver in a dark jacket who stood several steps away with the practiced invisibility of someone paid to be present and unobtrusive. He looked at the car and then at her. She was watching him look at it. So, he said. So, she said. They stood on the wet sidewalk while the last few other diners drifted past them, and the piano sound from inside the restaurant was barely audible now, just a presence at the edge of hearing. Your eyes gave you away, she said, when I walked in. I was already running through my apology in my head. I had it all organized. I was ready to be very efficient about how sorry I was. And then I saw your face. He waited. You looked... She chose the word carefully. Resigned. Not angry. Not even that hurt, really. Just settled into it. Like disappointment was just part of the landscape, and you'd learn to walk on it without stumbling. Something moved in his chest. He didn't say anything. I'm aware that's a lot to see from across a restaurant, she said, a slight wryness in her voice now. It's not wrong, he said quietly. I know. She looked at him steadily. That's what I meant about your eyes. Not that they're beautiful, though they are. I'm not going to pretend I didn't notice that too, but that you looked hurt and you weren't being cruel about it, to yourself or anyone else. He absorbed this. You're very direct, he said. I've been told. I'm not saying it as a criticism. I know. Another silence. A cab went by on the wet street, its tires hissing, its headlights making 2 quick sweeps across the pavement. Cora, he said, I need to pick up Cora. Of course. She didn't move to leave, but she wasn't holding him, just present. I had a good time, he said. He heard the surprise in his own voice, not at the sentiment, but at how true it sounded coming out of him. She heard it too. Her expression did something small and genuine. I did too, she said. More than I expected to. That's maybe the nicest thing you could have said. I told you I don't want to start things with a lie. You did say that. She extended her hand again, and he shook it again, the same grip as the beginning, firm and quick. Except this time, the handshake lasted about a half-second longer than the first one, as if both of them had made a small unconscious decision to not be in a hurry about it. Friday, she said. Yeah, he said. I'll try to be on time. I'll bring a book. She laughed again, that same slightly too loud genuine laugh, and turned toward her car, and her driver moved with quiet efficiency to open the door. Landon watched her go. Then he stood alone on the wet sidewalk in the cold October air for a moment, his hands in his pockets, looking at the orange reflections on the street, while the city moved around him the way cities do, indifferent and electric and full of things beginning. He pulled out his phone. "She showed up," he typed to Marcus. 3 seconds. "I know I was tracking her Uber." Landon stared at this for a moment. Then he put his phone away and walked to his truck. Mrs. Bellamy was a 71-year-old woman who had lived 3 houses down for 12 years, who made a pie from scratch approximately twice a month for no particular occasion, and who had taken it upon herself following Danielle's departure to keep a quiet, practical eye on Landon and Cora in a way that asked nothing in return and accepted thanks with a hand wave that made it clear the thanks were unnecessary. She opened her door before he reached the porch. "She fought sleep for an hour," Mrs. Bellamy said. "She wanted to be awake when you got back." "She's up?" "She's asleep now. Fell out about 15 minutes ago." Cora was on Mrs. Bellamy's couch, curled around her rabbit, fully unconscious with the absolute commitment that only small children can achieve, the kind of sleep that looks like she'd been asleep for hours and would be asleep for hours more. One sock had come off. Her hair was in the half-destroyed remnants of the 2 braids he'd done that morning, mostly undone now. He crouched beside the couch. She looked. Here was the thing about Cora, the thing that still knocked him sideways some evenings when he wasn't guarded against it. She looked exactly like what she was, completely herself, entirely complete. A whole person in the body of a small child, with her own logic and her own questions and her own serious opinions about grape shampoo and stuffed rabbits and whether the people in her life were nice. He gathered her carefully, the way he'd done 10,000 times. She stirred faintly, made a small sound. "Daddy?" "Yeah, Bug." "How was she?" He shifted her weight against his shoulder. "She was good," he said. A pause. "Was she nice?" He stood there in Mrs. Bellamy's living rooms with his daughter half asleep against his chest, and he thought about a woman standing on a wet sidewalk saying, "I don't want to start things with a lie." "Yeah," he said quietly. "She was nice." Cora made a sound of satisfaction and sank back into sleep. Landon carried her home. He didn't call her. That was the first thing. He had her number. Marcus had sent it along with the reservation details in a text that also included 3 unsolicited thumbs-up emojis. And he had looked at it twice over the weekend, each time setting his phone face down on the counter and walking away to do something else. Saturday, he recocked the upstairs bathroom. Sunday, he took Cora to the farmer's market on Clement Street, where she spent 40 minutes deliberating over which apple variety to purchase, as though the decision had geopolitical implications. He wasn't playing a game, he wasn't following a rule about waiting the appropriate number of days. He just genuinely didn't know what to say. And he had enough respect for the conversation they'd had to not want to start the next one with something hollow. On Sunday evening, while Cora was in the bath and he was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, his phone lit up. Unknown number. Then a second later, a text. "This is Vivian. I'm told I'm supposed to wait longer to text, but I never follow rules that don't make sense. How was your weekend?" He looked at the message for a moment. Then he looked at his cold coffee. Then he picked up the phone. "My weekend was caulk and apples," he typed back. "How was yours?" The 3 dots appeared almost immediately. "I worked Saturday. Sunday I visited my mom. She's doing a new round of treatment, the kind where you sit in a room for 6 hours while they run things through an IV and everyone pretends it's fine." He read this twice. "Is she okay?" he typed. She was making jokes about the hospital cafeteria by hour 4. "So, probably. That sounds like a good sign. She's that kind of person. I got it from her, I think. The deflecting with humor thing. Is that what you're doing now?" A longer pause this time. Long enough that he wondered if he'd misstepped. Then, "Maybe a little. Are you busy Friday?" He exhaled through his nose. Outside the bathroom door, Cora was singing something formless and off-key to herself. The private soundtrack she ran constantly, narrating or processing or simply existing in the way that 6-year-olds did, with no concern for audience. "I can do Friday," he typed. "I'll pick the place this time, and I'll be on time. I'll leave the book at home." "Ha." A pause. Then, "Good night, Landon. Good night." He set the phone down and sat with it for a minute in the quiet kitchen with the cold coffee and the sound of Cora's tuneless singing coming through the wall, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Something low-key and cautious, not excitement exactly, more like the feeling you get when you've been standing in a cold room and someone cracks a window and the air that comes through is warmer than you expected. He didn't trust it yet, but he noticed it. That felt like enough. The second date was a Vietnamese place in the Richmond district that Vivian had found through a food writer she followed, which Landon only knew because she mentioned it in the car. She'd picked him up, which had been its own small negotiation, him insisting it wasn't necessary, her pointing out that she knew where the restaurant was and he didn't, which was logistically irrefutable. The driver was a man named Gerald, who had the quiet competence of someone doing exactly the job he wanted to do, and who greeted Landon with a nod when he got in that managed to be both professional and genuinely friendly. The restaurant was small and warm and loud in the right way, the kind of loud that comes from people actually enjoying themselves rather than music filling dead air. The owner, an older woman with short hair and a sharp eye, greeted Vivian by name, which made Landon look sideways at her. "I've been here 4 times, Vivian said, sliding into the booth. She remembers everyone. She remembered you specifically. I always finish everything on the plate. She said it without pride, just fact. She told me that's how she knows someone actually liked it. She ordered for both of them, after asking about allergies and spice tolerance with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to making decisions, then catching herself and saying, 'Is that okay? I can—' and him saying, 'It's fine, I trust you,' which made something shift briefly in her expression before she recovered. Over pho and a plate of lemongrass chicken that arrived quickly and was extraordinary, she told him about the company. Not the press release version, not the founder's story that he'd already read in the 2 articles that came up when he'd Googled her, the ones with the soft focus photos and the quotes about disruption and the metrics that made her sound like a case study rather than a person. She told him the actual version, which was messier and less linear and involved a failed first attempt at 24 that she described with the specific, unsentimental clarity of someone who'd processed a failure long enough to see it clearly. "I built the wrong thing," she said. "I understood the technology, but I didn't understand the people who'd have to use it. I thought the product would teach them what they needed. It doesn't work that way." "What made you realize it?" "A woman cried in a user testing session." She turned her soup spoon over in her hand. "Not because the product was bad, because she couldn't figure it out and she thought it meant she was stupid. She said that out loud to a room full of strangers. She said, 'I think I'm just too old to understand this.' And she was 43 years old." She set the spoon down. "I shut down the project 2 weeks later. I'd been telling myself for months that the problem was the users not engaging correctly. That session was the first time I admitted that it was me." Landon was quiet for a moment. "That's not a small thing to admit. It's the whole job, though. If you can't do that, if you can't look at something you built and say, 'I was wrong about this,' you're just going to keep building the same mistakes in different shapes." She looked at him. "You know that already. You do it structurally, literally opening walls to find the problem. It's easier with walls. Walls don't have feelings about being wrong." She laughed. "That's the entire difference, yeah." What he was learning about Vivian Sterling, in pieces, the way you learn anything about a person who is genuinely complicated, was that the version of her that existed in public, in the articles and the conference panels and the profile photos, was not false exactly. It was just partial. The person in those pictures had learned to project competence and direction and a settled certainty about where she was headed, because that's what leadership in her world required. Because if the CEO walked into a room looking uncertain, the uncertainty propagated outward like a structural crack. But the woman across the table from him at a Vietnamese restaurant in the Richmond district, eating everything on her plate and talking about a 43-year-old woman crying in a testing session, had uncertainty in her. You could see it if you knew where to look. In the way she sometimes started a sentence and reconsidered it mid-word, in the way she held things back, not dishonestly, but carefully, like someone who'd learned the cost of saying too much too fast. He respected that. He understood the architecture of it. "Can I ask you something that might be rude?" he said. She raised an eyebrow. "You can try. How much of the The profile. The company's CEO thing. How much of that is actually you? She didn't bristle. She considered it seriously, which told him she'd thought about it herself. Most of it, she said finally. I'm not performing a character. The work is real. The decisions are mine. The stakes are real. She paused. But there's a gap between what the job requires you to be and what you actually are on a given Tuesday. She looked up. You know that gap? Yeah, he said. I know that gap. What does it look like for you? He thought about it honestly. On a job site, I have to be certain, even when I'm not. Especially when I'm not. Because if I'm uncertain, the guys working under me get uncertain, and that's when people get careless. And when people get careless, someone gets hurt. He picked up his chopsticks. So I've gotten very good at performing certainty, and sometimes I can't turn it off when I get home. She was watching him carefully. Cora will ask me something. A normal kid question, what's for dinner? Can we get a dog? Why is the sky dark at night? And I'll answer it like I'm running a morning briefing. He shook his head slightly. She called me out on it once. She was 5. She said, Daddy, you don't have to be the boss right now. Vivian's expression did something involuntary, something soft, quickly managed. She sounds extraordinary. She is, he said simply. She's also extremely demanding, and she cried for 40 minutes last week because her sock had a wrinkle in it. She contains multitudes. The laugh came again, that genuine, slightly too loud one. The older woman at the door glanced over and smiled at the sound of it. They stayed at the restaurant for 2.5 hours. They walked afterward, for no particular reason, through the residential streets of the Richmond where the old houses sat close together and the fog had started to drift in from the bay, softening the edges of the streetlights. Vivian had texted Gerald to pick them up in 30 minutes, which gave them the walk, and she'd said it without asking him if he wanted to, which he appreciated more than he would have been able to explain. My brother thinks I work too much, she said at some point during the walk, their footsteps quiet on the damp pavement. Do you? Yes, she said without hesitation. Objectively, yes. The question is whether too much is meaningful or whether it's just a judgment call. Your brother thinks it's meaningful. My brother is 28 and idealistic and the kind of person who believes boundaries are sacred, which I admire and find slightly exhausting. She said it with genuine affection, not dismissiveness. He also dropped everything to move back to the city when Mom got sick, which I couldn't do because of the company. She was quiet for a step or two. I told myself it was because I was managing it from here, coordinating her care, handling the financial side, which is all true. But he was the one physically there, in the room, for the hard hours. She looked at the fog-blurred houses. You can manage things from a distance. You can't be present from a distance. Landon said nothing. He knew better than to fill a silence that was doing necessary work. I'm working on it, she said after a moment. Not defensively, just stating a fact with the same directness she brought to everything. Aren't we all? He said. She looked at him sideways. That's either very wise or a complete non-answer. Both, he said, simultaneously. Gerald found them at the corner of 6th and Clement, exactly 30 minutes after Vivian had texted, and drove them back to Landon's neighborhood through the city's nighttime traffic. They sat in the back seat with a few inches of space between them and talked about smaller things. A podcast she'd been listening to about urban infrastructure, a book Cora had become obsessed with, whether the fog in San Francisco was getting worse or whether people just complained about it more. The conversation had the quality of two people who were no longer performing for each other and had not yet decided what to do about that. Gerald pulled up in front of Landon's house. The porch light was on. Mrs. Bellamy, who lived 3 houses down, had all her lights off except the kitchen, which meant she was still awake. Thank you for dinner, Landon said. You paid for the last one. You paid for the last one. That was the plan, she said. This one was mine too. You have to let me buy something at some point. Coffee, she said. Next time. You can buy coffee. He nodded. He was already reaching for the door handle. Then he stopped. Vivian. She looked at him. The thing you said on Friday, at the restaurant, about how I looked when you walked in. He paused, choosing the words carefully. I've been thinking about it. Not, I'm not bringing it up to make a thing of it. I just want you to know that I had no idea that was visible. She was watching him quietly. I thought I was pretty good at, he looked for the word, keeping it internal. You are, she said. You were, but I was looking for it. Why? Because I walked in 27 minutes late and you were still there. I needed to know whether that was politeness or whether you were actually... She stopped. Whether you were the kind of person who stays. The sentence landed somewhere deep and quiet. I don't know what kind of person I am yet, he said. I'm still working on it. That's the most honest thing you could say. Good night, Vivian. Good night, Landon. He got out of the car and walked to his porch. Behind him, he heard the car pull away, quietly, into the fog. The third date, he bought the coffee. It was a Saturday morning, 2 weeks after the Vietnamese restaurant, at a place in his neighborhood called The Anchor. Not a branded chain, not an aesthetic project, just a coffee shop that had been there since before the neighborhood changed, with a counter that needed refinishing and a chalkboard menu and a barista named Pete who'd been there so long he greeted regulars by name and newcomers by their order. He'd suggested it without overthinking it, which was itself a kind of progress. Vivian arrived in jeans and a dark sweater, no driver, having taken a rideshare, which he registered as a choice she'd made deliberately, not performing normalcy, just inhabiting it. Her hair was down and slightly messy in a way that was clearly its natural state and not any kind of styling, and she looked, he thought, more like herself than she had in either of the 2 previous evenings. As if without the restaurant setting and the professional context, there was a slightly different version of her that breathed more freely. She looked at the Anchor's interior, the mismatched chairs, the counter that needed work, the chalkboard with its crooked handwriting, and said, I like this place. Pete makes good coffee, Landon said. That's Pete? That's Pete. Pete set their drinks down without them asking. He'd seen Landon come in and apparently made decisions. Vivian looked at the cup in front of her. What is this? Cortado, Landon said. He saw you come in and made a judgment call. She looked at Pete, who was already back at the espresso machine with his back to them. Then she tasted it. He's right, she said. He usually is. It was the first time they'd met in daylight. Daylight was different. It had a way of removing certain kinds of performance, the same way you see a building differently without dramatic lighting. He'd been aware that she was attractive in the evenings, in the specific way that restaurant candlelight cooperated with, but in the morning light of the Anchor, she was attractive in a more plainly human way, which was somehow more complicated to deal with. She had a small scar on her jaw, hairline thin, clearly old, that he hadn't noticed before. She held her coffee cup with both hands. She had a habit of slightly tilting her head to the left when she was listening carefully, which he'd noticed before but not catalogued until now. Tell me about your company, he said. Not the article version. He'd read enough of those. Tell me something I wouldn't read. She thought about it. We had a product manager 2 years ago who was brilliant, she said. I mean, genuinely one of the clearest thinkers I'd ever worked with, and I let him go. Why? Because he was right in ways that made other people feel stupid. He wasn't cruel about it. He'd come into a meeting and you could see the room calculating how to avoid being the person who said the wrong thing in front of him. She turned the cup between her hands. Intelligence that makes people smaller is a liability. I had to make a call. Was it the right call? I think so. I also think about him sometimes when we're in a meeting struggling through something he would have solved in 8 minutes. She looked up. Both things are true. Good decisions are often also losses. He thought about the construction jobs he'd turned down, the ones that had come with something attached, a contractor who cut corners, a client who wouldn't listen, a timeline that was physically impossible, and how some of those had been the right calls and also small griefs. Yeah, he said. What? She said, because she'd learned already to notice when he went quiet in that particular way. Just, yeah, I know what that's like. He paused. I had a guy working for me about 3 years back, best framer I've ever seen. Genuinely, I'd put him against anyone, but he had a problem with, he considered how to say it, He made the younger guys on the crew feel like they were always one mistake away from being publicly humiliated, not raising his voice, just very cold, very precise about failure. What did you do? Talked to him twice. The second time he understood what I was saying and chose to keep doing it anyway. He set his cup down. So I let him go, and for about 6 months the framing took twice as long, and I had to eat the difference on 3 jobs. But the guys who stayed started getting better because they stopped spending half their mental energy waiting to get cut down. He looked at her. Culture's a structure. You can't have the foundation undermined and expect the walls to hold. She was looking at him with an expression that was hard to read entirely, thoughtful and something else. Do you know how rare it is, she said, to be in a conversation where the other person is actually making me think? Is that rare for you? In my professional life, not always. In my personal life, she stopped. I don't have much of a personal life, is maybe the honest answer. You've said that a couple of ways now. I keep saying it, hoping it stops being true. He laughed at that. Not at her. The laugh came from a place of recognition. I do the same thing, he said. I keep telling myself that after this project settles down, after this quarter, after Cora starts second grade, I'll have, space to be a full person. Does it work? There's always a next project. She pointed at him. Exactly. They were quiet for a moment, the coffee shop moving around them. 2 college students in the corner, an older man reading a newspaper in the way that people almost never did anymore. Pete at his machine with his methodical practiced movements. I want to ask you something, Vivian said, and I want you to answer it honestly, not kindly. That's a concerning way to start a question. Is this... She looked at her coffee cup. Is this weird for you? The whatever I am, professionally. The money. All of it. Does it create a thing? He was quiet for a moment, not performing consideration, actually considering. It would be easier to lie to you, he said. I know. At first, yeah, there was a thing. When Marcus told me and when I Googled you, there was a voice in my head that said, what's the angle here? Why would this be real? He met her eyes. Because people who have what you have don't usually... He stopped. Don't usually what? Don't usually need anything, he said. And if someone doesn't need anything, I don't have a place in the equation. She was very still. But that's... He exhaled. That's my problem, not yours. And I think I was wrong about the needing nothing part. You were, she said quietly. So, yeah, there's a thing, but it's getting smaller. Okay, she said. She didn't make it into a bigger moment than it was. She just absorbed it, that directness again, not flinching from the honesty she'd specifically asked for. Okay, he said. I appreciate it, she said. That's all. I appreciate that you didn't clean that up. You specifically told me not to. People say that and then do it anyway. I try not to do things I said I wasn't going to do. She studied him over the rim of her coffee cup with an expression that he was starting to learn, a slightly squinting focus, like she was adding him up against some private calculation. I'm going to tell you something, she said, that I haven't told any of the other... She stopped, started again. I don't do this easily. The showing up, the actual presence. I can run a company. I can manage 47 people and a board of directors and a quarterly earnings call, but this... She gestured between them, slightly awkward, which was itself notable. This I'm not good at. I seem capable. I know I seem capable. I'm very good at seeming capable at things. She set her cup down. But I've ended things before they started with people because I got spooked by my own life, by the gap between what I have and what I actually feel. She looked at him. I don't want to do that here. The sentence sat between them, simple and unornamented and carrying a lot of weight. Landon said, I don't want you to either. Okay. Pete appeared at their table without warning and refilled both cups without asking. He looked at neither of them. He was gone before either of them said anything. Does he always do that? Vivian asked. He has good timing, Landon said. She laughed again, and this time it wasn't too loud at all. 3 days after the coffee at the Anchor, Vivian's mother was admitted to the hospital. Not an emergency, scheduled, related to the treatment, but the kind of admission that reshuffles everything anyway because hospitals have a particular gravity that pulls the normal structure of life off axis. Landon found out because she texted him at 7:15 in the morning. "Mom's inpatient for observation. Might be a few days. I'll be in and out. Just so you know where I am." He read it. He thought about the phone call she'd taken in her car on the first night, the way she'd sat across from him and said, "Honestly, we don't know yet." He typed back, "Thank you for telling me. Let me know if there's anything useful I can do." A pause. Then, "I don't know what useful looks like right now. Everything's fine, or manageable, just a lot of waiting." He knew a lot about waiting in hospitals. Cora had been hospitalized briefly at age 3 with a respiratory infection, and he'd sat in a chair beside her bed for 36 hours without sleeping, watching the rise and fall of her small chest, listening to the beeping machines, learning the geography of the pediatric ward by heart. He knew the specific limbo of hospital waiting, the way time moves strangely, the way you rehearsed scenarios in your head, not because you believed them, but because your brain refused to be idle. "Waiting is the worst part," he typed, "not because you're doing nothing, because you're doing everything, and it's invisible." A longer pause this time. "Yes," she wrote. "Exactly that. Take care of your family," he wrote. "I'll be here." He set the phone down and went back to making Cora's breakfast, which this morning involved negotiating over whether the banana was ripe enough and whether Wednesdays were allowed to be cereal days, even though the established rule was that cereal was for weekends, a conversation that required his full diplomatic attention and which lasted until he had to draw on 7 years of working with people under stress to find a resolution that satisfied the 6-year-old across from him. Vivian texted intermittently over the next 4 days. Not constantly. She wasn't the kind of person who needed constant contact, and he wasn't either, which was a compatibility they'd stumbled into without negotiating it. But there were small messages, things she'd noticed in the hospital: a janitor who whistled while he worked at 2 in the morning, a vending machine that dispensed chips in inexplicably random order, her mother making a nurse explain a medical term 3 different ways because she wanted to understand what was actually happening to her own body. "She's the most stubborn person I've ever met," Vivian wrote at 11:30 one night. The doctor tried to summarize and she said, "I'd like the full version, please." "That explains some things about you," Landon wrote back. "Was that a compliment?" "Yes." He could almost hear the laugh. Her mother came home on day 5, which Vivian reported with a text that said simply, "She's home, eating her own cooking." First thing she did was criticize the hospital's idea of chicken soup. And then, a moment later, "I'm really glad she's okay." He looked at those 2 texts for a moment, the humor and then the drop below the humor, the real feeling that came through when she stopped managing the presentation of it, and typed back, "Me too." On the Sunday after her mother came home, Vivian called him. Not texted, called, which felt different, more deliberate. He was in the backyard with Cora, who was engaged in some kind of construction project involving sticks and mud and ambitions that exceeded the available materials, and he stepped to the edge of the yard and answered. "Hi," Vivian said. "Hi." "I wanted to hear your voice," she said, without preface, without managing it. Just said it. He stood in the late afternoon light in his backyard, mud on his shoes from where he'd stepped into Cora's project zone, and felt something settle in his chest in a way that was warm and slightly terrifying. "I'm here," he said. "I know." A pause. "How's Cora?" "Currently building what I believe is a fort, or possibly a city. She hasn't confirmed which." "Does she narrate while she works?" "Constantly." He heard her exhale. Not sad, just present. "Tell me what she's doing." So he did. He stood in the yard and described Cora's construction project in real time. The stick that wasn't cooperating, the mud patch she'd identified as having the optimal consistency, the ongoing commentary she was providing to an audience of one stuffed rabbit propped against the fence. And Vivian listened from wherever she was, her mother's house or her own apartment, and occasionally made a small sound that meant, I'm here, keep going, and it wasn't a romantic moment exactly. It wasn't a moment that would make it into any version of a love story where things were clean and cinematic. It was just real. Just two people on the phone in the late afternoon, one of them watching a 6-year-old narrate her own construction project to a rabbit, and somehow that was better than any dinner had been. I should go, she said eventually. Yeah. Landon. Yeah. A pause. I'm glad I walked into that restaurant. He looked at Cora, who had just successfully balanced a particularly large stick on top of her structure and raised both fists in triumph. He watched her celebrate by herself in the mud, completely unself-conscious, completely alive to the achievement. Me too, he said. He meant it. He was surprised by how much he meant it. After the call, he stood in the yard for another minute. The light was going gold and thin. The fog was coming in from the west, the way it always did this time of year, low and slow, folding itself over the rooftops. He still didn't trust it entirely. He wasn't sure he was capable of trusting something new entirely yet, but the distrust felt smaller now than it had 2 weeks ago, and smaller than it had the week before that. Structures changed under load. That was the nature of them. You built for what you expected, and then life put different weight on it, and you had to find out if what you'd built could hold. He didn't know yet, but he wasn't walking away from it. That felt like something. The first time Vivian met Cora, it was an accident. Not in the sense that it was unplanned. It was deeply unplanned, which was different. Landon hadn't arranged it. Vivian hadn't asked for it. It happened the way a lot of real things happened, which was sideways, while you were looking somewhere else, before you'd had time to prepare a version of yourself for it. It was a Saturday morning in November, 6 weeks after the blind date, and Landon had brought Cora to the farmer's market on Clement Street, the same one from the apple incident. Because Saturday morning was farmer's market morning, and had been since Cora was old enough to walk the stalls without being carried, which she'd insisted on approximately 8 months before she was actually ready for it. He'd agreed because she'd been so certain, and then spent 6 months catching her before she walked into things. He had not told Vivian he'd be there. Vivian had not told him she would be. She had simply mentioned in a text 2 days earlier that she liked the Clement Street market, that a woman there sold a particular variety of persimmon she'd been buying every November since she was a teenager and her mother had first taken her, and that it was one of the few weekend rituals she maintained regardless of work. He had, if he was honest with himself, not fully connected these facts until he looked up from the flower stand and saw her 20 feet away, reading a chalkboard sign in front of a produce table with the focused expression of someone who had come with a specific purpose. She was in a dark coat, hair pulled back, a canvas bag over one shoulder, and she looked entirely unlike the woman in the Forbes profile that had come up when he'd Googled her 6 weeks ago. Not unrecognizable, but present in a different way, like the difference between a photograph and the actual room. Cora, who had been holding his hand with one hand and a paper bag of small gala apples with the other, said, "Daddy, you stopped walking." "I know," he said. "Why?" He didn't answer immediately. Vivian was still reading the chalkboard, hadn't looked up, was reaching out with one hand to test the firmness of something he was too far away to identify. He thought about whether to walk over or whether to let it be a coincidence she'd discover on her own. He thought about whether Cora was ready. He thought about whether he was ready, which was probably the actual question. Cora followed his gaze with the unerring target acquisition of a 6-year-old who had noticed her parent looking at something. She studied Vivian across the market. Then she looked back at Landon, then at Vivian again. "Is that her?" she said. "I don't know who you mean," he said, which was transparently untrue. "The date lady," Cora said, in a volume that was designed for long distances. 2 people near them glanced over. Landon closed his eyes briefly. "Her name is Vivian," he said. "Should we go say hi?" He looked at his daughter, her serious face, her paper bag of apples, her absolute lack of anxiety about the situation, and felt something shift. "Yeah," he said. "Come on." He was 3 steps away when Vivian looked up. She saw him first. Her expression did what it had started doing when she saw him. That small, honest recognition, uncalculated. And then she registered Cora beside him, and the expression shifted into something that was not quite preparation, but was adjacent to it. A brief alertness. A person making a decision very quickly. "Hey," Landon said. "Hey." She looked at Cora with directness, the same kind she brought to everything, but softer, calibrated without being condescending. "Hi, you must be Cora." Cora looked up at her with the full, unguarded assessment of a child who had not yet learned to pretend she wasn't evaluating someone. She took in Vivian's coat, her bag, her height, her face. The whole inspection lasted about 4 seconds. "My dad said you were nice," Cora said. "He told me the same thing about you," Vivian said. Cora appeared to weigh this. "He doesn't lie," she said, as though this were a relevant piece of corroboration. "Good to know." "Are you getting persimmons?" Vivian glanced at the produce table behind her. "I am. Do you know what a persimmon is?" "It's an orange fruit," Cora said. "But it's not an orange. My teacher told us." "Your teacher is right. Here," Vivian reached into the canvas bag and produced one. A hachia, deep and glossy, and held it out. "You can feel how heavy it is. The ripe ones get really soft, like—" She tilted her head, choosing her description. "Like a water balloon almost. When they're ready." Cora took it carefully with both hands, weighing it, turning it over. She looked at the pointed base of it. "Why is it shaped like that?" "I don't actually know," Vivian said. "I've never looked it up." "We could look it up," Cora said. "We could," Vivian agreed. Landon stood there with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching his daughter and this woman discuss the evolutionary reasons for persimmon geometry, and something happened in his chest that was quiet and complicated, and felt like it had been building for longer than 6 weeks. Like a wall you'd been reinforcing for years, and you looked up one day and realized someone had been on the other side of it the whole time, and you'd both been pushing in the same direction without knowing. He didn't say anything. He just stood there and let it happen. They walked the rest of the market together. Not by design, but because it was the natural outcome of the next 30 minutes, Cora moving between them with the matter-of-fact ease of a child who categorized new people quickly and had apparently categorized Vivian into the acceptable column within the first persimmon conversation. She held Vivian's hand at one point without asking, because there was a gap in the foot traffic she wanted to move through faster, and she grabbed the nearest available hand, and Vivian looked down briefly at the small hand in hers and didn't say anything, just kept walking. Landon noticed. He was always noticing things he wasn't sure yet what to do with. They got coffee at the edge of the market, a stand run by 2 brothers who had been there for years, bad paper cups, excellent espresso, the kind of place that survived on consistency and neighborhood loyalty, and stood at the edge of the street in the November cold while Cora ate a piece of the fruit bread she'd negotiated out of Landon at the previous stand. "You're good with her," Landon said quietly while Cora was occupied. "She's easy," Vivian said. "She tells you exactly what she's thinking. That's what makes her exhausting." "And good," Vivian said without missing a beat. He looked at her sideways. "Yeah, and good." They stood with their bad coffee in the cold air, and the market moved around them, and it was the first time the 3 of them had been in the same space, and it wasn't a scene from anything. It wasn't cinematic or symbolic. It was a farmer's market on a Saturday morning with paper coffee cups and persimmons. It was ordinary in the most specific way. That was what made it feel like something real. The third time Vivian saw Cora, the first 2 being the farmer's market accident and a brief pickup situation 2 weeks later where they'd exchanged approximately 4 sentences in a driveway, was intentional. Vivian had asked, with characteristic directness but also a careful tentativeness that Landon had come to recognize as the way she moved into territory that mattered to her. "Would it be okay if I joined you and Cora sometime? Not a big thing, just whatever you'd normally do." "Whatever we normally do is pretty undramatic," he'd said. "That's what I want," she'd said. So on a Saturday in early December, she came to the house at 9 in the morning, no driver, in jeans and a sweater she'd clearly grabbed without much thought, and the 3 of them went to Cora's school fair, which was the kind of event that involved paper chains and a beanbag toss and a cakewalk and at least 45 minutes of standing in lines, while children negotiated the relative merits of various prizes. Vivian stood in the beanbag toss line with Cora and took the game completely seriously. Not in a performed way, in a genuinely competitive way, the kind that came from someone who apparently didn't know how to be halfway invested in anything. She studied the throw distance. She adjusted her angle. She hit the target on her third attempt and said, under her breath, the kind of word you weren't supposed to say at a school fair, which made Landon laugh harder than he had in months. You cannot say that here, he said. There was no one close enough. There was absolutely... He gestured behind her, where a woman with a stroller had gone very still. Vivian turned, registered the stroller, and turned back with an expression of genuine chagrin. I thought I said it quieter than that. You did not. Cora, who had watched this exchange with great interest, said, It's okay. I know that word. You do not need to know that word, Landon said. Derek said it when he dropped a hammer. Derek is not a role model. Derek said you said it too when the... We are moving on, Landon said firmly. Vivian pressed her lips together in the specific way of someone trying very hard not to laugh in front of a child they are attempting to make a good impression on. They moved on. Lunch was at a taco place 3 blocks from the school, a narrow room with long communal tables and salsa in plastic containers and a wait that was worth it. Cora had a quesadilla. Vivian had 2 tacos and the queso and started reading the ingredients card on the salsa verde with professional interest. Do you cook? Cora asked her. A little, Vivian said. Not well. Daddy cooks well, Cora said. He makes the chicken that I like. What's the chicken that you like? Cora looked at Landon for the technical details. Roast chicken, he said, with garlic and lemon. She's been requesting it since she was 4. It's the best thing he makes, Cora said with complete authority. What's the best thing you make? Vivian considered this seriously. Scrambled eggs, probably. Cora nodded slowly, the way she nodded when she was processing new information and cross-referencing it against existing data. That's a breakfast food, she said. It is, Vivian agreed. Do you like breakfast? I love breakfast, Vivian said. I often just don't have time for it. Cora's expression suggested she found this troubling on a fundamental level. You should have time for breakfast, she said. Daddy says it's the most important meal. Daddy's right. I know, Cora said. Landon ate his taco and said nothing, and was, for a moment, simply happy in a way that was uncomplicated and unfamiliar, and which he didn't poke at because he'd learned that happiness that you examine too directly sometimes dissolved under the attention. On the drive home, Landon driving, Cora in the back seat with her school fair prizes, Vivian in the passenger seat, a song came on the radio that Cora knew from somewhere, a pop song, the kind of relentlessly cheerful music that 6-year-olds adopted with total commitment, and she began singing it loudly and incorrectly in the back seat. Vivian looked at Landon. He shrugged in a way that meant, this is my life, and also I know, and also what do you do? And then Vivian started singing along. Wrong words, wrong key, fully committed. Cora's volume went up. Landon drove through the December streets with these 2 people he'd had no plan to know 6 weeks ago singing a song he didn't know in his car. And the feeling from the farmer's market came back, that quiet, complicated thing in his chest, but louder now, more insistent. He kept his eyes on the road. He was smiling. What he understood about Vivian by December was that she was not who the articles said she was. Not wrong, exactly. The articles had the facts. But in the way that facts about a building don't tell you what it feels like to be inside it, the public version of Vivian Sterling left out most of the things that made her who she was. She was impatient with inefficiency in a way that occasionally made meetings brutal for her staff. And she knew this about herself and was working on it with imperfect results. She had a habit of going silent on a topic she was thinking through, sometimes mid-conversation, which alarmed people who didn't know her, and which he'd learned to read as processing rather than withdrawal. She was bad at asking for help in a way that was very specifically the bad of someone who'd had to be self-sufficient for a long time and had confused self-sufficiency with strength. She had opinions about structural design that were, for a non-professional, remarkably well-informed. She'd studied architecture for 2 years before switching to computer science, which she'd mentioned once, incidentally, and which explained the way she sometimes looked at buildings when they walked past them, the slight upward gaze, the brief focus. She was afraid of things. Not many, but genuinely afraid. The thing with her mother had surfaced a fear she didn't fully acknowledge, but that showed in how she answered her phone when her brother called. A split second of held breath before she said hello, every time. She was afraid of being the kind of person who was present in the big moments and absent in the daily ones, which was a specific fear that came from specific evidence in her own life. She was lonely in a way that she had managed so successfully for so long that she sometimes forgot it was loneliness and called it independence. He knew all of this not because she'd delivered it to him in organized installments, but because he'd been paying attention, which was the thing Vivian didn't expect from people. Not because she thought they were incapable of it, but because in her professional world, attention was strategic. It came attached to purpose. Nobody studied Vivian Sterling out of simple curiosity. Landon studied her because he was interested. That was all. And the more he looked, the more there was. The hard conversation happened on a Wednesday evening in the middle of December. They'd been at his house. She'd come for dinner, the roast chicken that Cora had apparently been requesting on his behalf in her own way. And after Cora was in bed, they'd been sitting at the kitchen table with the remains of the meal between them and wine he'd actually bought this time. A bottle he'd asked Pete about because Pete turned out to have inexplicably strong wine opinions. It had been easy, the evening. The too easy kind. The kind that sometimes preceded difficulty the way calm weather preceded fronts. He'd been quiet for a moment, and she'd noticed, the way she always noticed. "What?" she said. "I need to say something, and I'm trying to figure out how." She set her glass down, not tensing exactly, more like settling into the ground. "Just say it." He looked at her. "What are we doing?" She was quiet. "Because Cora—" He stopped, started again. "Cora talks about you now. She asked me this morning when you were coming back, and I need to—" He exhaled. "I need to know if this is—" "If this is what?" Vivian said. Her voice was even, but he could see the effort in it. "Real," he said. "I need to know if this is real, not the nice person version of real, actual real. Because I can't let her get attached to someone who has 1 foot in and 1 foot out. That's not a judgment of you. It's just where I am. I have to ask." The silence lasted long enough that he heard the refrigerator cycle on. The neighbor's dog barked twice. The distant sound of a car on the wet street. "I'm scared," Vivian said. "Of what specifically?" "Of exactly this." She looked at her hands on the table. "Of wanting it enough that when it doesn't work, it—" She stopped. "I don't have a good record with this. Not with relationships. I have a limited record. But with things I've wanted. I go all in, and I either win very big or I lose in a way that I don't recover from quickly." "This isn't a company, Vivian." "I know that." She looked up at him, and he could see the effort she was making to stay in the conversation rather than manage it. "I know that, but the stakes feel bigger, not smaller, bigger." He was quiet, letting her have it. "I think about you when I'm in meetings," she said. Not in a distracted way, in a grounding way. I think Landon would find a way through this, and it helps me find my way through it." She said it like she was confessing something she'd been holding. "And Cora? I didn't expect Cora. I thought I could be adjacent to her, friendly, appropriate, but she made a helpless gesture with one hand. She just includes you. She doesn't wait for permission. She doesn't know how," Landon said. "I know." Something in Vivian's expression broke open, just slightly. "I know, and I don't know how to be that. I never learned how to just include people without calculating the risk first." He looked at her for a long moment. "I'm not asking you to stop calculating," he said. "I'm just asking you to tell me what the calculation says." She met his eyes. "It says, I want this," she said. "It says I want this more than I'm afraid of it. And the afraid part is, that's just noise. That's always been noise." He was quiet. "Is that enough?" she asked. And there was something in it that was very unlike the version of Vivian Sterling that ran a company and made decisions in front of boards. There was something genuinely uncertain, a real question. "Yeah," he said. "That's enough." She exhaled, and then she picked up her wine glass and said, "Your table needs refinishing, by the way. The grain is lifting along the edge." He blinked at the change. Then he laughed, a real one. "I know, I keep putting it off." I have a contractor. I am a contractor. Then what's the holdup? Cobbler's children, he said. No shoes. She looked at the table edge, the lifting grain, the small domestic evidence of a man who spent his professional attention fixing everyone else's structures and came home to his own unfinished. She ran her finger along it lightly. I could help, she said, with the sanding, if you walk me through it. He looked at her. You want to refinish my kitchen table. I've never done it. I want to learn. She met his eyes over the wood grain. I want to learn your things. He didn't answer that right away. He sat with it for a moment. Then he said, Okay. There was a day in the week before Christmas when everything went wrong at once in the specific way that things did during the last weeks of December. Every deadline arriving simultaneously, every deferred problem surfacing, every person at maximum capacity at the same time. Landon had 2 crews finishing competing projects on overlapping timelines, one of which had a client who was calling 3 times a day to ask questions, the answers to which had not changed since the previous call. He'd woken at 5 to a text from his site foreman saying the concrete delivery had been pushed back 48 hours, which compressed the entire remaining schedule in a way that required him to spend 2 hours on the phone reorganizing sequencing before he'd had coffee or gotten Cora dressed. Cora, who sensed the disturbance the way children sensed atmospheric pressure changes, had decided this was the morning for maximum friction. Refusing her breakfast, losing a shoe that was ultimately found in the refrigerator for reasons she couldn't explain, and crying at the school drop-off in a way she hadn't done since the first week of kindergarten. He drove away from the school with the window down in the cold air, breathing through it. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. Vivian. He considered for a half-second whether to answer in this state. Then he answered, Hi. She heard it immediately. He knew she heard it because of the slight pause before she said, What happened? Everything, he said. The professional version and the personal version simultaneously. Cora? She's fine. She just had a hard morning. I think she feels the energy when I'm stressed and it comes back out sideways. That's exactly what it is, Vivian said. Kids are accurate instruments for their parents' emotional states. Yeah, he exhaled. I know better, and I still let it bleed through. You're not a machine, Landon. I know. I mean that as information, not a comfort. He smiled despite himself. What did you need? I was calling to ask if you wanted to have lunch, but you clearly have... No, he said. Lunch sounds good. He didn't finish the sentence. I'll come to you, she said. Just tell me where the site is. He paused. You want to have lunch at a construction site. I want to have lunch with you, she said. The construction site is incidental. She arrived at 12:15 in a car she'd driven herself, which still occasionally surprised him, with a bag from a Thai place 2 miles from the site that she'd apparently Googled on the way. She stood at the edge of the site in her coat, looking up at the building with that architecture student gaze, and he met her at the perimeter, and she handed him the bag and said nothing about the morning. They sat on the tailgate of his truck and ate Pad CU out of containers, and she asked him about the project, the real version, the concrete delivery problem, the sequencing issue, and listened while he talked it through, not offering solutions he hadn't asked for, just present, just there. You're not going to tell me it'll be fine, he said after he'd laid it out. It will probably be fine, she said, but you don't need me to say that. You already know it'll be fine. You needed to say it out loud to someone who wasn't going to immediately try to fix it. He looked at her. I know that need, she said. I have it too. Marcus never... He stopped. Marcus wants to fix things, she said. He's a fixer. It's how he shows love, but sometimes you don't need a fix. Yeah, he said. Sometimes you just need... Pad CU on a tailgate, she said. He laughed, and it came from a deep enough place that it helped. Around them the site worked. Machinery moved. Men called to each other across the distance. The cold December air carried sawdust and diesel and the particular smell of construction that he'd known since he was a teenager working his first summer job. A smell that meant work being done, things being built, the physical world being changed by the application of human effort. She sat beside him on the tailgate of his truck, eating noodles and watching the sight with uncomplicated interest. And he thought about what she'd said months ago, about finding herself happiest in ordinary moments. He understood it now in his body, not just his head. She wasn't here because his life was impressive. She was here because she wanted to be here. The difference between those two things was the whole thing. After lunch, she walked back to her car, and he watched her go. And she was halfway there when she turned and looked at him with an expression he was starting to know. That direct, slightly squinting assessment, followed by a small, unguarded smile that she reserved for moments when she'd stopped managing her own presentation. She raised one hand, a small wave, the kind that contained more than a wave. He raised his hand back. She got in her car and drove away, and he stood at the edge of the site in the cold December air with the bag of empty takeout containers. And the structure behind him kept being built, and the afternoon kept moving, and the day that had started badly had turned into something else entirely. Not perfectly, not cleanly, just better. In the specific, earned way that better sometimes arrived when you had someone in your corner who showed up with noodles and didn't try to fix what didn't need fixing. That night, after Cora was in bed and the site logistics were handled, and the client had been talked down from his third call of the day, Landon sat at his kitchen table, the one with the lifting grain along the edge, the cobbler's unshod table, and texted Vivian, "Thank you for today." The response came back within a minute. The noodles were medicinal. He typed, "The company more than the noodles." A pause. Then, "Keep that up and I'll have to come back with dessert." He put the phone face up on the table and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at the lifting edge of the table grain, ran his thumb along it the way she had, feeling the rough catch of it. He'd refinish it, he decided. He'd do it before the new year. Maybe she'd help. They refinished the table the week between Christmas and New Year's. It took 2 days, which was 1 day longer than Landon had estimated, because the first day was mostly Vivian asking questions he hadn't anticipated. Not basic questions, not the kind you ask to seem engaged, but specific ones. The kind that came from someone who was actually trying to understand the process, rather than participate in it decoratively. Why that grit progression? Why oil finish over polyurethane? What happened if you didn't let it fully cure before use? And was there a visible difference or just a structural one? He answered everything. It was the first time he'd explained his work to someone who listened the way she listened. The slight head tilt, the follow-up questions that proved she'd heard the previous answer. The occasional silence that meant she was integrating information rather than waiting for him to stop talking. Cora supervised from a chair she'd pulled to the kitchen doorway, wrapped in a blanket with her rabbit, issuing periodic commentary. "It smells weird," she said, about the finish. "It's the oil," Landon said. "Is it supposed to look darker?" "For now. It'll lighten when it dries." Cora considered this. How does Vivian know how to do that? "She's learning," Vivian said from behind the sanding block. "You're doing good," Cora said with the magnanimous air of someone conferring a meaningful compliment. "Thank you," Vivian said seriously. Landon looked at the tabletop and did not say anything. The second day was the finish coat, which required patience and light brush pressure and a long waiting period during which nothing could touch the surface. They sat on the kitchen floor against the cabinets, eating sandwiches and waiting for the first coat to tack up, which took 45 minutes, and Cora had migrated from her chair to the floor between them, without comment, and the three of them sat in the kitchen that smelled of oil finish and watched a nature documentary Cora had chosen about deep-sea creatures, which she narrated at intervals with supplementary information from school. "That one has no eyes," she said, about an anglerfish. "It doesn't need them down there," Vivian said. "No light." "How does it find things?" "Pressure changes in the water. Electrical signals. It senses the world differently than we do." Cora looked at the anglerfish for a moment. "That seems lonely," she said. Vivian went quiet in the particular way that meant something had landed. Landon glanced at her and she was looking at the screen, not at Cora, but her expression had shifted into something interior. "Sometimes it probably is," she said. Cora accepted this and moved on to the next creature. Vivian looked at the floor for a beat and then looked at Landon, and he looked back at her, and neither of them said anything, because the thing between them in that moment didn't need language, and they both knew it. The table was done by New Year's Eve, fully cured, the grain sealed and smooth and darker than before, in a way that was actually an improvement. Vivian ran her palm across it and said, "That's really good. You did half of it. I did the parts you told me to do exactly when you told me to do them." "That's construction," he said. She looked at the table for a moment. The surface, the fixed edge, the thing that had been unattended to for too long and was now resolved. And he could see her thinking something she wasn't saying, though she'd gotten better at saying things over the months. "What?" he said. "Nothing. I just like that we made it better together." He let that sit. "Me too," he said. New Year's Eve itself was not dramatic. Landon had never been a New Year's Eve person. The performative significance of the date had always felt arbitrary to him, one midnight like any other dressed in borrowed meaning. He'd spent the last 3 New Year's Eves at home with Cora, who had managed to stay awake until 11:45 the first year and 9:30 the next 2, and who treated the holiday primarily as an opportunity to wear a specific sequined headband she kept for the occasion. This year, Vivian came over at 8 with a bottle of sparkling water for Cora and a bottle of actual wine for the adults, and a container of the fancy crackers she'd brought once before that Cora had declared the best food she'd ever eaten, a judgment she maintained despite Landon pointing out that she'd said the same thing about 3 other foods in the preceding month. They played a board game, Cora's Choice, a game involving colored tiles that had rules she adjusted in real time to favor her own position, which both adults pretended not to notice because the alternative was a 20-minute negotiation neither of them had the energy for. They ate cheese and crackers. Cora fell asleep at 9:52 in the armchair, sequined headband askew, which was a personal best. Landon carried her to bed. He came back to the living room to find Vivian standing at the window with her wine, looking at the street where, in the distance, some early celebrators had sent up a firework that arced and faded over the rooftops. He stood beside her. "Happy almost New Year," she said. "Happy almost New Year." They watched the street for a while. Another firework, closer this time, a brief red bloom over the neighbor's oak tree. "Last New Year's Eve," she said, "I was in Singapore. Board meeting that had run 3 days over. I watched midnight from a hotel window by myself with room service pasta and a conference call briefing in my ear. Was the pasta good? It was fine. It was fine pasta eaten alone in a hotel room on New Year's Eve. And this year?" She turned to look at him, and her expression was something he hadn't seen from her before. Not the directness, not the calculation, not even the warmth she'd been showing him in layers since October. It was simpler than all of those. It was just gratitude, uncomplicated, sitting in her face without any management around it. "This year is better," she said. "By so much." He took her hand, not dramatically, just reached down and took it, the way you do with someone you've stopped being tentative with, and felt her fingers close around his and stay there. They watched the last minutes of the year pass in the orange light from the street, the fireworks becoming more frequent now, the distant sound of celebration carrying through the glass, and the house was quiet around them, with Cora asleep in the back room and the refinished table behind them, and the particular stillness of a space where someone has started to belong. He wasn't keeping score of the moments. He wasn't adding them up toward a conclusion. He was just in it, present in it, which was harder for him than it sounded and which he'd been working on since October. Just before midnight, she said quietly, "I'm falling in love with you." He turned to look at her. She was looking at the window, not at him, in the way of someone who'd said a true thing and wasn't certain yet about the consequences of having said it. He turned her gently toward him. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "I am too," he said, in case that wasn't clear. Something released in her face. Not tears. She wasn't a person who cried easily, he'd learned, but something adjacent to relief, the specific expression of someone who'd been carrying weight and just put it down. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. Outside, midnight arrived with fireworks and horns, and the distant sound of people on the streets choosing to mark it loudly. And in Landon's living room, 2 people stood at the window holding hands and said nothing at all, which was exactly the right response. January was hard. Not between them. Between them, the new year had a solidity that the previous months had been building toward. a quality of things that had been decided. Between them, January was actually easier. But everything around them was harder, the way January always was. Post-holiday contraction, the projects that had been deferred until after the new year arriving simultaneously, the gray weight of winter settling in on the city. Landon's largest ongoing project hit a subcontractor dispute in the second week of January that required 3 days of conversations he'd rather not have had. A supplier he'd used for 2 years delivered a material order with a quality variance that he caught before installation and had to return, which set 2 jobs back by a week. He came home on the worst of those days and sat at the refinish table and stared at it for a while. Vivian's January was its own category of difficult. She was in the middle of a company expansion that had been 18 months in the planning, and the timeline was compressing in ways that required her to be in back-to-back decision mode for weeks at a stretch, which took a toll she didn't fully admit, but which showed in the tightness around her eyes and the way she answered her phone, faster, sharper, the professional mode bleeding longer into the evenings. They didn't see each other as often that month. This was the first real test of what they'd built. Not a crisis, not a dramatic rupture, just the ordinary pressure of 2 full lives trying to coexist, and the question of whether what existed between them could hold up under the ordinary weight. It was a Thursday night, late January, when she texted at 10:15. "I'm sorry, I've been absent this week." He was in bed, not asleep, reading a book he hadn't retained more than 2 pages of. He looked at the text. "I know," he typed back. "I have too. Are you okay?" Functionally, yes. Internally, I don't know. I keep running on professional mode and forgetting to turn it off. "That thing you said I did in October?" "Yes. Apparently it's catching." He smiled at the ceiling. "Come over Saturday," he typed. "No agenda. Cora wants to show you something she made at school." A pause. "What did she make?" "I'm not going to tell you. You have to come see. That's manipulation. It's called an incentive." "What time Saturday?" He put the phone down and looked at the ceiling for a moment. The thing Cora had made was a drawing, produced in art class, of 3 figures in front of a house. The figures had the specific proportions of children's drawings, oversized heads, stick limbs, features that suggested rather than depicted. The tallest one had a construction helmet rendered in yellow crayon. The middle one had dark hair and was holding what appeared to be a bag. The small one had a headband. Under the drawing, in Cora's emerging handwriting, she had written, "My family." Landon had found it in her backpack on Friday and stood in the kitchen holding it for a long time. He showed it to Vivian on Saturday without preamble, handing it to her when she came through the door, still in her coat, before she'd even set down her bag. She took it. She looked at it. For a full 10 seconds, she didn't say anything. "Cora drew this?" she said finally. "At school." She was still looking at it. He could see her processing it, the things she did with significant information, the internal calibration, the checking of the feeling against available data. "Does she know you're showing me?" she said. "No." Vivian looked up at him. Her eyes were doing the thing they sometimes did when she'd stopped performing steadiness, slightly brighter, slightly less managed. "What do you want to do with this?" she said, and the question was bigger than the drawing. "I want to honor it," he said, "whatever that means going forward." She looked at him for a moment, then she reached out and took his hand in both of hers, the drawing still between them, and said simply, "Okay." It wasn't a plan. It wasn't a declaration with steps attached. It was just 2 people looking at a child's drawing of a family and agreeing quietly to try to be what it showed. Cora noticed things the way she noticed everything, matter-of-factly, with the specific attention of a person who was 6 years old but had been watching the adults in her life carefully for most of those years, having learned early that adults were the weather system that determined her world, and weather bore watching. She noticed that Vivian remembered things she'd said in previous conversations, not because she was keeping notes, but because she actually listened. She noticed that Vivian didn't talk to her in the slightly elevated register some adults used with children, the overbright cheerfulness that felt like a costume. She noticed that Vivian asked questions that assumed she had thoughts worth hearing. She also noticed the things that weren't perfect. She'd noticed early on that Vivian sometimes looked at her phone when she shouldn't, and that she occasionally caught herself doing it and looked guilty in a way that was visible if you knew where to look. She'd noticed that Vivian sometimes went quiet in a way that made the room feel like it was waiting for something, and that Landon had learned to just wait alongside her without pressing, which seemed to be the right call. She'd told Landon, with complete frankness, after a dinner in February, Vivian is sometimes sad about something. He'd crouched down to her level. What makes you think that? Her eyes, Cora said simply. They go far away sometimes. He hadn't known what to say to that. Should I ask her about it? Cora said. I think, he said carefully, that you could just keep being nice to her, and she'll tell us when she's ready. Cora considered this. That's what you did for me, she said, when I was sad about Mama. The word landed softly, the way Cora had always been able to land that word. Not as a weapon, not even intentionally as a weight, just a fact she was stating. Yeah, he said, that's what I did. Okay, Cora said, and went back to what she was doing. The conversation with Vivian about her mother happened in March, on a quiet Sunday afternoon when Vivian had been at the house most of the day, and the particular quality of her quietness had shifted from the contemplative kind to something more pressurized, like weather building. They were washing dishes, a division of labor they had arrived at without discussing. He washed, she dried. Cora had been excused on account of a complicated homework assignment involving counting by fives that had defeated them all earlier, and Vivian said, without looking up from the cup she was drying, the oncologist used the word remission last week. He turned the water off. Preliminary, she said. It's preliminary. They're not calling it conclusive, but the scans came back better than the last 2 rounds. He turned to face her. She was still looking at the cup, turning it in the dish towel. Vivian. She looked up. That's good news, he said. I know. Her voice was steady, but her hands weren't quite. I know it's good news. I've been sitting with it for a week, and I still can't. Every time I let myself feel it, there's this. She stopped. There's this voice that says, don't trust it yet. Don't relax yet. Because you've been braced for so long. Since September, she said. Since before the first date. I've been running on this background current of waiting for bad news, and I don't know how to. She set the cup down carefully. I don't know how to turn that off. I don't know if I'm allowed to just feel relieved. He took the dish towel from her hands, set it on the counter. He stood in front of her and took both her hands in his and held them steady, not saying anything, because what she needed wasn't words, and he knew that about her by now. She looked at him. You're allowed, he said. You are completely allowed. She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, they were clearer. I cried in my car for about 20 minutes, she said. In the parking garage? Top level. There's never anyone up there. I know that floor, he said. She laughed, a little waterlogged. I know you do. He pulled her in. Not dramatically, just the way you held someone who needed to be held, arms around her, her forehead against his shoulder, the two of them standing in the kitchen in the Sunday afternoon light. She allowed it for about 45 seconds before straightening, which he understood was about the maximum she could sit still in something that required her to be vulnerable, and he was already learning to receive what she could give and not push for more. Your mother, he said. She should meet Cora. Vivian looked at him. If she's going to be okay, he said, she should know what her daughter's got going on. Something happened in Vivian's face that he could only describe as a door opening, not dramatically, just an opening. She's been asking, Vivian said quietly. I know, you've mentioned. She's been asking since November. She paused. I kept saying it wasn't the right time. Is there a right time for this kind of thing? She thought about it seriously, which was how she thought about everything. No, she said. Then I'll ask her if next Sunday works. He nodded. She looked at him steadily. You know you're terrifying, right? How so? You make things simple, she said. That should not be as terrifying as it is. Coming from you, he said, I think that's a compliment. It is, she said, fully. The lunch with Vivian's mother, Eleanor Sterling, happened on a Sunday in late March when the light was finally starting to do what spring light did, going longer and softer, the city coming out of its gray winter posture, the trees in the park down the street beginning their slow declaration of intent. Eleanor lived in a house in Pacific Heights that had been her home for 30 years, a tall Victorian that bore the particular character of a house that had held a lot of life without being renovated into impersonality. There were family photographs on the walls that hadn't been rotated or modernized. There were books and shelves that were organized by some private system that wasn't alphabetical or by genre. There was a coat rack by the door with 6 coats on it, including 2 that could only belong to a woman in her 70s. Thick wool, slightly worn at the cuffs, the kind that lasted because they were made to last. Eleanor Sterling answered the door herself, without staff, and Landon's first impression was that she was exactly where Vivian had come from and also completely different from her daughter. She was shorter than Vivian, with the same dark eyes but an entirely different deployment of them. Where Vivian's gaze was forward and assessing, Eleanor's was warm in a way that moved, that reached toward you, the kind of warmth you recognized as real because it arrived before you'd done anything to earn it. She crouched down, immediately, to Cora's level, which was not an easy crouch for a woman who had recently completed a cancer treatment, a fact Landon was aware of and watched carefully, and said, "You must be Cora. Your father's told me absolutely nothing about you, which means I get to find out for myself. What's the first thing I should know?" Cora, who could usually size up a new adult within about 30 seconds, had apparently reached her conclusion before Eleanor finished speaking. "I like persimmons," she said. "Vivian taught me." Eleanor looked up at Vivian with an expression of private satisfaction that contained about 15 years of motherly opinion. "Did she?" she said. "Don't," Vivian said. "I haven't said anything." "You said a lot." "With my face," Eleanor said pleasantly. "Which is allowed." Landon looked at these 2 women, the mother and the daughter, the warmth and the steel, the open hand and the measured one, and understood in that moment something about Vivian that the previous 6 months had only been showing him in pieces. He understood where the capacity for love had come from, the real kind, the kind that didn't require conditions. It had come from this woman in the Victorian house with the lived-in coats, who crouched despite her joints because a 6-year-old deserved to be met at her level. Vivian had learned it, even if she'd learned it harder. Lunch was loud in the way of a table where everyone was talking and no one was particularly managing the conversation. Eleanor asked Cora questions with the focused interest of a person who genuinely wanted to know the answers, and Cora responded with the full, frank inventory of her opinions, which ranged across school, the relative merits of different apple varieties, a boy in her class named Xavier, who she described as annoying but not mean, which was a distinction she apparently found important, and whether or not deep-sea creatures were probably scared of the dark, or if they didn't know what dark was because they'd never seen light. Eleanor considered the last question with genuine seriousness. "I think they don't know what they're missing," she said, "which might be the best way to be." Cora found this unsatisfying. "But what if they do know? What if they can feel it's missing even if they can't name it?" Eleanor looked at Landon, then at Vivian, then back at Cora. "That is a very good question," she said. "How old are you?" 6 3/4. "You think like someone older." "My dad says I think like a problem that needs solving," Cora said, not without pride. "Your dad is smart," Eleanor said. After lunch, Eleanor and Cora migrated to the sunroom where Eleanor had a collection of houseplants that Cora found fascinating, and the adults could hear them talking at intervals. Eleanor explaining the names of things, Cora explaining why she thought the names should be different. Vivian and Landon washed up in the kitchen. Same division of labor as at his house, arrived at without discussion. "She loves her," Vivian said, quietly, meaning her mother and Cora. "Yeah," Landon said. "Cora's easy to love." Vivian was quiet for a moment. "My mother just asked her what she thought about things," she said, like her thoughts mattered right out of the gate. "They do." I know, but not everyone—" She stopped. "Most people treat kids like apprentice people, like they're not quite the real thing yet. Your mom doesn't." "No." Vivian looked toward the sound of the voices in the other room. "She never did that to me either. She always treated me like my thoughts mattered even when I was wrong. Especially when I was wrong." She paused. I've been thinking about that a lot. Since the diagnosis. How much of who I am came from being treated that way. He was quiet, letting her have it. I want to be that, she said. For Cora. I want to be someone who treats her like her thoughts matter. He turned the water off. He dried his hands. He turned to face her. You already are, he said. She looked at him with the expression he'd first seen on a wet sidewalk outside Carmine's, but the one that was past performance, past management, just her, plain and real. I'm trying, she said. I know, he said. That's the same thing. There was a night in April, an ordinary Tuesday, not a date night, not a planned occasion, just a Tuesday, when everything felt, for a few hours, like it was too much. Landon had come home from a job site at 6:30 to find a voicemail from Danielle. Cora's mother called in frequently enough that each call arrived with its own weight, and this one was no different. She was coming to San Francisco in 3 weeks. She wanted to see Cora. She hoped that was still okay. She was sorry for the short notice. He stood in the driveway for a minute after he heard it. He'd always known this was the architecture of the situation, that Danielle existed, that she would come in and out of their lives on her own timing, that his job was to handle it cleanly for Cora's sake. He'd managed it. He would manage it again. But the voicemail had arrived on a Tuesday after a long day, and he was tired, and the part of him that he didn't usually let have an opinion about Danielle was having one. He called Vivian before he went inside. He didn't plan to. He just found himself dialing. Hey, she said on the second ring. He could hear her office behind her, the faint ambient sound of an active building. Her mom called, he said. A brief silence. Then, okay? She's coming in 3 weeks. She wants to see her. Is Cora going to know before she gets here? I'll tell her this week. Give her time to feel whatever she feels about it. How are you? He considered the question honestly. He exhaled. I know it's fine. It's fine. She's her mother. She has every right. That's not what I asked. He leaned against the truck. Up the street, a kid on a bike went past with headphones in. The late afternoon light was going gold. I'm a little angry, he said, which I don't usually let myself be. Why not? Because it doesn't help. Sometimes it doesn't have to help, Vivian said. Sometimes it just is. He looked at the gold light on the houses across the street. Yeah, he said. Will you tell me how the conversation with Cora goes? Yeah. And if you need to, she paused. If you need to be angry somewhere that's not in front of her, you can be angry here. I can hold that. He was quiet for a moment. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. Go see your kid. He went inside. Cora was at the kitchen table with her homework, pencil in hand, working with the focused ferocity she brought to everything she considered important. She looked up when he came in. You were in the driveway a long time, she said. I was on the phone. With Vivian? Yeah. Cora looked at him for a beat, with those eyes that saw too much. Is everything okay? He put his bag down. He sat in the chair across from her at the table they'd refinished together. Him and Vivian, and indirectly Cora, who had supervised from the doorway with her rabbit, and he looked at his daughter. I have something to tell you, he said, and I want you to know there's nothing wrong, nothing bad is happening. She waited. Your mom called, he said. She's going to come visit in a few weeks. She wants to see you. Cora looked at the table. She looked at her pencil. She looked at her homework. Then she looked at him. Is she staying here? No. She'll be in a hotel. You'll spend some time with her, maybe a day, maybe a couple of days, and then she'll go back. Will you be there? Whatever you need. She thought about this with the seriousness she brought to the important things. I want Vivian to be there when she comes, she said. He hadn't expected that. He let it sit before he answered. That's not... He chose his words carefully. That's not really something I can promise without talking to both of them first. But she makes things less scary, Cora said, simply. Not because she fixes things, just because she's there. Landon looked at his daughter. He thought about a woman on a wet sidewalk saying you have kind eyes. He thought about persimmons at the farmer's market and Pad CU on a tailgate and bad words at a school fair beanbag toss and a drawing in a backpack that said, "My family" in a 6-year-old's handwriting. He thought about all the ordinary days that had accumulated into something he hadn't planned for and couldn't have designed and wouldn't have changed. "I'll talk to her," he said. Cora nodded, satisfied, and went back to her homework. He sat at the refinished table and watched her work and thought about what she'd said. She makes things less scary, not because she fixes things, just because she's there, and understood that his daughter had just articulated, with the blunt precision of a 6-year-old, the exact thing he'd been unable to find words for himself. He picked up his phone. "Cora says you make things less scary," he typed to Vivian. "Not because you fix things, just because you're there." He watched the 3 dots appear. Then, "I've never been told anything better in my life." He looked at that sentence for a long moment. Then he set the phone down and sat at his table in his kitchen in the evening light, with his daughter doing her homework 3 feet away, and felt the specific, earned weight of something that had been built slowly and carefully and imperfectly and was holding. It was holding. Danielle came on a Friday in late April, which was the kind of detail that didn't matter and also somehow mattered entirely. The way the timing of things shaped how they landed, the way Friday carried the weight of the week behind it, and the openness of the weekend ahead. The way Cora had gone to school that morning, knowing her mother was already on a plane and had eaten exactly half her breakfast before deciding she was done. Landon had told Cora on the Sunday before, as he'd promised himself he would. Enough time to feel things without so much time that the feeling had nowhere to go. The conversation had been shorter than he'd expected. Cora had listened. She'd asked 2 questions, whether her mother looked the same and whether Landon would be close by. He'd answered both honestly. He didn't know, and yes. She'd nodded, picked up her rabbit, and gone to her room. He'd stood in the hallway afterward, doing the thing he always did when parenting exceeded his preparation, running a quick internal inventory of what he'd said, whether it was enough, whether he'd been honest without being heavy. He never reached a satisfying conclusion. He just did his best and accepted that his best was incomplete, which was the central humbling fact of raising someone. Vivian had not asked for details about Danielle. She'd asked how Cora was. She'd asked how Landon was. She had not, at any point, made the situation about herself, which he'd noticed and filed away in the growing account of evidence about who she was. The morning Danielle arrived, Vivian sent a single text at 7:15. "I'm here if you need anything. No pressure to update me. Just, I'm here." He'd read it standing in the kitchen in the early gray light, and something in his chest had gone quiet in a useful way. Danielle met Cora at a park on Saturday morning. Neutral ground, Landon's suggestion, accepted without argument. She was thinner than Landon remembered, and her hair was different, and she looked, when she saw Cora coming across the grass, like someone who was trying very hard to manage the size of the feeling they were having. Cora stopped 3 feet away and looked at her mother with the direct, undefended gaze of a child who hadn't yet decided how to feel. Danielle crouched down. "Hi, Bug," she said quietly, using the name she couldn't have known Landon also used, the same instinct arriving from 2 separate directions. Cora looked at her for a long moment. Then she stepped forward and let herself be hugged, not returning it immediately, but not resisting it either, standing inside it, while she figured out what it meant to her. Landon stood 20 feet away on the path with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched his daughter navigate something no 6-year-old should have to navigate. And he did what he'd been doing for 4 years. He kept his face quiet and his body open, and he did not make the situation his own. Later, he would think about that moment as one of the hardest and most important things he'd ever done, standing 20 feet away, staying out of it, letting Cora have her own experience of her mother without his feelings running interference. He'd had a lot of practice at absorbing pain quietly. He hadn't always thought of that as a useful skill. That day it was. Cora spent Saturday with Danielle. Landon dropped her off at 10 and picked her up at 5 and spent the hours between doing work he couldn't focus on and talking to Marcus on the phone for 40 minutes, which was the most they'd talked in weeks. "How are you actually doing?" Marcus said. "I'm fine." "Landon, It's fine. It's what it is. She's her mother." "That's not what I asked." "You sound like Vivian." A pause. "Is that a good thing?" Yeah, Landon said. It is. When he picked Cora up, she was quieter than usual. Not sad, not upset, just interior, the way she got when she was processing something large. She held his hand on the walk to the truck and didn't talk for the first few minutes of the drive. He didn't push. At a red light, she said, she cried. He kept his eyes on the road. Yeah? When she had to go, she cried. Cora looked at her hands in her lap. I didn't. How do you feel about that? She thought about it. I don't know, I felt sad she was sad. But I wasn't sad the same way she was sad. That's okay. Is it? Yeah, feelings aren't right or wrong. They're just yours. She looked out the window, a long pause. She said she's going to try to come more. Okay. I don't know if I believe her, Cora said. He absorbed this. He wanted, instinctively, to say something reassuring, to promise that her mother would come through, that things would be different, that Cora could trust this. He wanted to offer her the comfort of certainty, but he'd decided years ago that he would not lie to her about things that mattered, and this mattered. I think, he said carefully, that you can just take it one visit at a time. You don't have to decide right now what to believe. She considered this. That's good advice, she said, with a gravity that was so entirely 6 years old and also entirely her. Thanks, he said. She went back to looking out the window. Then, after another block, can we call Vivian when we get home? Sure. I want to tell her about the playground. There was a dog there and it had a hat on, an actual hat. He exhaled. A dog with a hat. A very small hat, Cora confirmed. It was important. He reached over and briefly squeezed her knee, and she put her small hand on top of his for a moment, and the rest of the drive home was quiet in the way that was full rather than empty. He called Vivian from the driveway while Cora went inside. How was it? Vivian said. About what I expected. Hard in the ways I knew it would be hard. He paused. Cora handled it better than I did. She usually does. Yeah. He looked at the steering wheel. She wants to call you, tell you about a dog with a hat. A beat. Then, with the genuine delight she rarely performed and often felt, a dog with a hat? Apparently it was important. It sounds important. He sat in the quiet car for a moment. The evening was coming in, that soft April dusk that smelled like new grass and someone's dinner from down the street. Vivian. Yeah. Thank you for the text this morning. I didn't do anything. You were there, he said. That's what you did. That's all I needed. A silence that was warm. Go call me from inside, she said. I want to hear about the hat. The month after Danielle's visit moved the way months did after significant events, faster than the events themselves, the daily structure reasserting itself, the sediment of ordinary life covering over the disruption and smoothing it into the past. Cora went back to full appetite and full volume and her ongoing construction projects in the backyard. Landon went back to the sites, the scheduling, the subcontractor negotiations, the daily work of building things that would outlast the building. And Vivian. Vivian was navigating her own reckoning, one that had been quietly accumulating since her mother's preliminary remission in March, and which crested finally on a Tuesday evening in mid-May when she called Landon at 9:30 and said, I think I need to change something. He could hear the quality of the silence around her on the phone, her apartment, late, the city below. What kind of change? Work, she said. The structure of it. A pause. I had a board meeting today, 6 hours, and for the last 90 minutes I was sitting in that room and thinking about nothing about the meeting. I was thinking about Eleanor's garden, about how she mentioned the roses were finally coming back after the treatment disrupted her schedule for them. He was quiet, listening. I have never, in 10 years of running this company, I have never sat in a board meeting thinking about someone's garden. She said it not with horror, but with something more like wonder. And I realized that wasn't a problem. That was information. What did it tell you? That I've been building the business at the expense of the life. She said it simply, without self-pity, the way she said things she'd been turning over long enough to see clearly. I knew that. I've known it. But I kept thinking the life was what happened after the next quarter, and I think there isn't an after. A pause. The next quarter always comes. Yeah, he said. So I'm going to bring in an operational COO, she said. Someone who can carry the daily infrastructure, and I'm going to step back from the pace I've been running at. A beat. Not abandon it, not hand it off. Just rebalance. Give myself actual days that are mine. How does that feel? Terrifying, she said, and correct. Those two things come together a lot. I know, she exhaled. I wanted to tell you because some of it involves you and Cora. I want to have more of this. More dinners and farmers markets and board games where she cheats openly and she stopped. I want more of the ordinary things. I want them to be the main thing, not the thing I squeeze in. He was very still. Okay, he said. Okay? Yeah. He could hear his own voice doing something it didn't usually do, something that was more open than was comfortable, but comfortable enough. I want that too. I know, she said. I know you do. I just needed to say it out loud so it was real. It's real, he said. It's real, she agreed. There was a beat of quiet that held everything it needed to hold. Landon. Yeah. I love you, she said. Not the way she'd said it on New Year's Eve, carefully, looking away, the first brave time. This was different. This was the version that had been tested by months and was reporting back. I love you too, he said, and it came out like something that had always been true and had just been waiting for the right sequence of events to become sayable. Good, she said. That's settled then. He laughed. Good night, she said. Good night. He put the phone down in the quiet kitchen and sat at the table. The refinished table, the fixed-edge table, the table that had been unattended to for too long and was now something better. And he looked at it for a while, the smooth surface, the sealed grain, the evidence of a thing that had been repaired not by replacing it, but by attending to it. He thought not for the first time about the things you built versus the things that built you. He was 32 years old. He'd spent the better part of 4 years becoming the specific, load-bearing version of himself that Cora needed, reliable, steady, present. And he'd been so focused on that particular construction that he'd stopped asking what the structure was for. You built the walls, you sealed the foundation, you made it sound and weatherproof and able to hold weight. But a building with no interior life was just a shell. He hadn't known he'd needed something inside until something arrived. The first anniversary of the blind date was in October, a year from the rain-wet night and the late entrance and the 4 words that had reorganized the previous 12 months without either of them entirely understanding in the moment what they were starting. Landon had thought about it for weeks. Not obsessively, practically, the way he thought about anything that mattered, turning it over, looking for the right approach, the way you looked for the right way into a wall, the angle where the structure made sense, and the work went cleanly. He'd considered dinner at Carmine's, which would have been symbolic, and which he'd rejected because Vivian wasn't someone who needed callbacks, and he wasn't someone who did things for the symbolism when the substance was available. He'd considered something elaborate, which he'd rejected because elaborate had never been the language between them. Their language was smaller, more specific. It was roast chicken and cortados and sanding blocks and the back tailgate of a truck and 30 minutes at a farmer's market discovering that his daughter and this woman had the same theory about persimmons. What he came up with was simpler than he'd planned and more right than anything else he'd considered. He'd made a frame, a small one, cedar, with a glass front. The joinery clean and precise, the wood finished with the same oil finish they'd used on the table. It had taken him 3 evenings in the garage after Cora was asleep, which was the time he used for the work he did for himself rather than for clients. The frame was good, not showy, not decorative, the kind of thing that held something and got out of its way. Inside the frame was a card. The card was off-white, the kind of cardstock that felt like something, and on it, in handwriting that had taken him longer than he would admit to get right, he wrote the same 4 words she'd said when she walked in out of the rain and looked across a restaurant and chose, without reason, to be honest. You have kind eyes. He gave it to her on a Saturday morning in October, on the anniversary of the date itself, at the kitchen table with the coffee going and Cora at her homework and the weekend light coming through the windows in that particular October way, low and amber. The kind of light that made everything look like it was worth keeping. He just set it in front of her, no ceremony. She looked at it. She picked it up. She looked at the frame, the joinery, the wood, registering what it was and what had gone into it. She turned it over and saw the hanging hardware on the back, the 2 small picture hooks he'd included in an envelope taped to the frame. Then she looked at the card inside. She sat with it for a long moment. He watched her face move through things. The recognition, the weight of it, the 12 months that those 4 words now carried, the rain and the waiting and the persimmons and the table and the hospital parking garage and the kitchen and New Year's Eve and all the ordinary Tuesdays and all the difficult ones. And all the ones that were just regular days that had accumulated into something that was, in its accumulation, extraordinary. She looked up at him. She didn't say anything for a moment. Her eyes were doing the thing they did when she'd stopped managing what showed in them, when the expression was just her, without any architecture around it. "You made the frame," she said. "Yeah." "In the garage." 3 nights. She looked at it again. "The joinery is really good." "Thanks. The finish matches the table." "I used what was left." She set it down carefully on the table. She looked at the words again, then she looked at him. "I was going to say something eloquent," she said. "I had something prepared." "What happened to it?" "You happened to it." She shook her head slightly. "You made me a frame." "I build things," he said simply. She laughed. The laugh, the real one, the slightly too loud one that she'd stopped correcting in front of him sometime around December, the one that Cora had adopted as a signal that the atmosphere was good, because it always was when that laugh was in the room. Cora looked up from her homework at the sound of it. She looked at the frame on the table. She looked at Vivian. She looked at Landon. "Is that a present?" she said. "Yeah," Landon said. "For Vivian?" "Yeah." Cora looked at the frame again with her scientist's eye. "Did you make it?" "Yeah." She nodded slowly. "That's better than buying something," she said, with complete authority, and went back to her homework. Vivian looked at him over the top of Cora's head with an expression that said several things simultaneously, and all of them were true. "Where are you going to put it?" he asked. She looked at the frame. She'd been keeping an apartment in the city, a sleek, well-furnished place that looked like it had been arranged by someone who spent most of their time elsewhere, which she had been, but the apartment had begun to feel less like where she lived and more like where she slept between being somewhere else. She'd been spending more time at Landon's house, not by announcement, just by the natural drift of where she wanted to be. "I want to put it here," she said. "If that's—" "Yeah," he said. "Here's good." She picked it up. She stood and went to the kitchen wall, the one between the window and the hallway, where there was a small blank space he'd never quite gotten around to filling with anything, and she held it up, testing the height. "Here?" she said. "Little higher," he said. She adjusted. "Here?" "Yeah, right there." She marked the spot with her thumbnail and took the envelope with the hooks off the back of the frame and set them on the counter and looked at him expectantly. "Hammer's in the second drawer," he said. She opened the second drawer. She found the hammer. She looked at the hooks, looked at the wall, and proceeded to hang the frame with the particular focus of someone who had learned to do something new and was doing it correctly. First hook slightly imperfect, second hook adjusted, frame level. She stepped back. It was straight. 4 words behind glass in a cedar frame on the kitchen wall of a house she'd come to know better than she'd ever expected to. In a year she hadn't planned, beside a man she'd been late to meet, because of a phone call she'd taken in her car because her brother had needed her, because their mother was sick, because that was the shape of the actual world. Never the clean line you'd planned, always the detour that turned out to be the route. "Good?" she said. He looked at it on the wall. "You have kind eyes." He thought about the man who'd sat alone at that table for 29 minutes, checking his phone, reaching for his jacket, deciding that nothing ever came easily, and this was just more evidence. He thought about how close it had been. How many versions of that night existed in parallel, where he'd left a minute earlier, where she'd been 5 minutes later, where neither of them had stayed long enough to begin. He thought about what he'd learned in 12 months, about the cost of closing off, not as a moral failing, but as a practical one. The way a sealed wall that doesn't breathe develops damage you can't see until it's structural. He'd sealed himself in the name of protecting Cora, in the name of being reliable, in the name of being the kind of man who didn't ask for more than the situation required. And he'd been right to be careful. He didn't regret the carefulness. But carefulness wasn't the same as being closed. He understood that now, in a way he hadn't at 31, hadn't at 30, hadn't in all the years of getting through it. Vivian had walked in and said 4 words, and he'd stayed at the table, and that had been the whole thing, the whole turning point. Not because the words were magical, because he'd chosen to stay. "Yeah," he said, "it's good." That afternoon, the 3 of them went to the farmer's market on Clement Street. It was October, which meant persimmons, and Cora made straight for the table where the woman had them displayed with the focused intention of someone returning to a known quantity. She picked one up and held it in both hands to feel the weight, exactly as Vivian had shown her a year ago, almost to the week, and turned to show Vivian the one she'd chosen. "This one's ripe," Cora said. "How can you tell?" Vivian asked. "It's heavier than it looks," Cora said. "You told me that's how you know." "I did tell you that." I remembered. Vivian looked at her, this child who had arrived in her life sideways at a farmer's market and had proceeded to simply include her without asking permission, and had never once treated her as temporary or provisional or anything other than a known quantity. And her face did the thing it did when she'd given up managing it. "Good job," she said. "I know," said Cora, and purchased the persimmon with the $1 she'd brought specifically for this purpose, having planned the transaction apparently the night before. Landon walked between them through the market stalls, the October light going gold above the street, the city moving around them with its indifferent and specific beauty. And he thought about something Eleanor had said to him privately at that Sunday lunch in March, standing in the kitchen while Vivian and Cora were in the sunroom with the houseplants, her voice quiet and matter-of-fact, her dark eyes steady. She'd said, "My daughter doesn't let people in easily. She never has. Even as a small child, she needed to be certain before she'd trust. The time she's been hurt, it was always because she trusted too soon without enough evidence." He'd listened. "She trusts you," Eleanor had said. "I can see it. The way she sits in a room with you is different. She's not monitoring." She'd paused. "I just want you to know that I see it. And I'm glad." He hadn't known what to say. He'd thanked her, which had felt inadequate. "Don't thank me," Eleanor had said, with the wave that meant thanks were unnecessary. "Just keep being what you are." Walking through the market now, watching Cora carry her persimmon with both hands and tell Vivian about a book she'd read at school that week, he understood what Eleanor had meant, not as instruction, as observation, the plain, uncomplicated thing. Just keep being what you are. He wasn't a different person than he'd been a year ago. He hadn't transformed. He still woke at 5:30 and worried about site schedules and made roast chicken on Sundays and dropped Cora at school with her hair not quite right and said things imperfectly and needed more sleep than he got, and occasionally sat at the table after Cora was in bed and stared at the wall because his brain wouldn't stop. He was the same man. He'd just stopped treating the walls he'd built as permanent. That was all. That was the whole change. It turned out that was enough. In the evening, after the market and a late lunch and an hour in the park, where Cora had attempted to teach Vivian a clapping game that required more coordination than either of them would admit, they came back to the house. Cora fell asleep on the couch before 7, still in her coat, persimmon on the coffee table beside her, rabbit in her arms. Landon and Vivian sat on the back porch steps as the October dark came in, the city glowing softly at the edges, the fog somewhere out over the bay not yet arrived, the stars occasionally visible between the passing clouds. She had her shoulder against his. They'd been quiet for a while in the good way. "I keep thinking about what you said," she said, "a few months ago, about structures changing under load." "I said that?" "In your driveway, I think, after one of the first dates. I was in the car and you were standing there." She looked at the dark yard. "About how you build for what you expect, and then life puts different weight on it." "I didn't know you were paying that much attention." "I pay attention to everything you say," she said. You know that. He did know that. It still surprised him occasionally. What about it? He said. I think I spent a long time building for the wrong load, she said. I built for professional weight, maximum capacity in the direction of work, and then everything else, the personal stuff, the family stuff, I thought those would just fit around what I'd built. She paused. But that's not how it works. You don't get to build for one kind of weight and then put a different kind on it and expect it to hold. No, he said, you don't. You have to know what you're building for. She looked at him. I know now. He held that. What are you building for? He said. She was quiet for a moment, not because she didn't know, because she was choosing how to say it. This, she said, I'm building for this. The word was small and it covered everything. The porch, the yard, the dark city beyond the fence, the child asleep inside, the refinished table, the frame on the wall, the farmer's market in the October light, the years behind and the years ahead, and all the ordinary Tuesdays still coming. He leaned his head slightly against hers. Me too, he said. They sat in the October dark while the city breathed around them, and the fog finally arrived from the bay, quiet and slow, folding itself over the rooftops the way it always did this time of year, and it felt like the world settling, like the end of a day that had been worth having. Landon Pierce was 32 years old, and he was not, by any accounting, a man to whom things came easily. He had a 6-year-old and a small business, and a kitchen table he'd refinished himself, and a circle of friends that fit on one hand and calluses that would never fully go away. He was imperfect in specific, well-documented ways. He got tired. He went quiet when he should speak, and sometimes spoke when he should be quiet. He'd made decisions he couldn't unmake and carried the weight of them the way you carried any weight, sometimes without noticing it anymore, and sometimes feeling every pound of it. And on a rainy night 1 year ago, he'd almost left a restaurant before a woman arrived, and she'd walked in and looked at him and said something true, and he'd stayed, and everything that came after, everything that was sitting on that porch with him and asleep on that couch and hung on that kitchen wall, came from that small decision. He didn't think there was a lesson in it, exactly. He wasn't the kind of person who needed things to resolve into lessons. But if there was something he'd come to understand, it was this: the choice to be decent when there was no reward for it, to be patient when there was no reason, to stay at the table when the easier thing was to leave. Those choices weren't invisible. They were the most visible thing about you. They were what people saw first. They were what lasted. Vivian's head was resting against his shoulder now, her eyes partly closed, the long day finding her. He looked at the side of her face in the city glow light, the scar on her jaw, the dark lashes, the person he'd been building toward all along without knowing he was building toward anything. He thought about 4 words on a piece of card in a cedar frame on a kitchen wall, not the words themselves. What they'd carried forward. You could spend a lot of time looking for the thing that would change your life and never find it because you were looking for something large and it arrived small. It arrived in a rainy doorway. It arrived in the weight of a persimmon held in 2 hands. It arrived in a drawing from a backpack that said "My family" in crayon. It arrived in the ordinary moments that didn't announce themselves as extraordinary until you looked back and understood what had been built, quietly and by hand, one day at a time. He put his arm around Vivian's shoulders, and she settled closer, and the fog came in over the rooftops. And somewhere inside the house, Cora was breathing in her deep, committed sleep, and the city carried on being itself all around them, and none of it was perfect. All of it was enough. More than enough. More than he'd known to ask for. And that, the gap between what you think you can have and what life sometimes quietly offers when you stop closing the door on it, that was the thing worth noticing. That was the thing he planned to spend a long time not taking for granted.